The sound began subtly, almost like a murmur. At first, he didn't pay attention to it. He thought it might be the sound of old plumbing or some broken pipe. But as the days went by, the noises became more constant, louder. They weren't casual noises like the creaking of an old structure or the wind pushing against windows. It was something else. Something that froze his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Martin's apartment was not big. It was a modest space in an old building in a city where the buildings seemed to be so close to each other that their walls often touched. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. In his life, he had accepted solitude as a constant companion. With each passing day, the stillness of her home brought her peace. That peace, however, slowly began to crumble as the noises intensified. At first, he thought he was crazy, that maybe he was losing his mind. Throughout her life, she had dealt with stress and anxiety, but something about those sounds was just fine for her. Disturbing. They were low, almost unintelligible at first. A soft tapping, a deep vibration that didn't come from the walls but from somewhere below. Would they be the foundations of the building? The old elevator that went up and down at all hours? But the nights passed and the noises grew, as did the feeling that something was not right. They were no longer mere tapping. Now he could hear whispers, as if someone was whispering his name from the shadows of the floor below. The first real awakening of the restlessness occurred one night. After several weeks of hearing those strange sounds, Martin woke up in the middle of the night, agitated, sweat soaking his forehead. He sat up quickly, trembling, as if something had touched him. There was a chill in the air, a chill that did not come from the open window but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was then that he heard it clearly, a dragging, as if something heavy was dragging on the ground. He was not human. It couldn't be. The feeling of dread enveloped him completely. Without thinking, he got out of bed and went out into the hallway. He looked at the door of the apartment next door. It was empty. It had always been empty. There had never been anyone on the lower floor. Martin had investigated at first, looking for answers to those noises, but he had never found anything. Something didn't fit. Something in that building was completely wrong. He decided to take matters into his own hands. If the noises were coming from the lower floor and no one was there, then what was causing them? And why did he feel those noises calling to him, as if someone were whispering to him in the dark? The basement door was locked, but that didn't stop Martin. That night, armed with a flashlight and a determination that arose from pure fear, he went into the basement. At first, his flashlight barely shone a couple of meters in front of him, but as he advanced, the air became denser. The stench as of stagnant moisture filled his lungs and made him cough. Something was not right. Not only was the air strange, but the walls seemed to be full of scars, marks I couldn't identify. The feeling that someone was watching him grew with each step he took. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Darkness grew around him, and for a moment he thought the world was fading away. Then a noise made him stop. A dull thud, a creak, as if something heavy was moving in the dark. Martin swallowed hard and kept going, although his body asked him to flee. Finally, the flashlight shone on a figure, a shadow in the darkest corner of the basement. The first thing he noticed was the shape of this creature. Its body was tall, skeletal, covered in pale gray skin that seemed to absorb light. The eyes, if I could call them eyes, were two black, empty orbs, glowing with a yellow, inhuman light. That creature was not human nor animal. It was something much older, something that was hiding in the shadows, feeding on something I couldn't understand. Martin could not move. He was paralyzed with terror. The creature, with slow but sure movements, began to crawl towards him. Every step he took echoed off the walls as if the ground was shaking. Martin tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. Fear had trapped him. The creature got closer and closer. A cold breath ran down Martin's back, and darkness closed around him. He could feel the weight of that presence, as if he were being absorbed by it, as if the shadows themselves were surrounding him, taking possession of his being. At that moment, the flashlight flickered again, and in the darkness, Martin could hear a whisper, one he would never forget. "It's too late." The shadow of the creature spread through the basement, and Martin, unable to react, fell to the ground. The creature silently moved even closer, brushing its skin with its icy touch. The creature then began to speak in a strange whisper, a murmur that seemed to penetrate its mind. He told him dark stories, stories of those who had fallen before him, those who had come too close to the lower floor and paid the price. There were beings, entities, dwelling in darkness, waiting to be awakened. Martin, hearing those words, felt his soul being torn apart. An indescribable fear consumed him as the creature dragged him into the shadows. At that moment, Martin understood the worst of all. Not only was the creature a being who lived in darkness, but that darkness was his home, and he had stepped into his realm beyond what was allowed. Terror enveloped every corner of the apartment as the figure disappeared from their sight. No one saw Martin again. No one heard the strange noises coming from the lower floor again. The creature, however, continued to wait, feeding on the darkness and the lost souls that time and again fell into its trap. A few months later, a new tenant moved into the building, and that same night, the whispers on the lower floor began again. It all started one afternoon like any other. Joseph was at home alone as always. He was a man of quiet life, nothing out of the ordinary. His daily routine consisted of working in his office, eating a light dinner, and sleeping early. He had left behind a relationship that had marked him, and now he lived in this house with an air of loneliness that comforted him. The walls of her home, though gray and somewhat worn, had something cozy about them. There was something about them that gave him peace, though he had never stopped to wonder what it was exactly. One day, as he was getting ready to leave for work, he looked at himself in the hallway mirror. He was adjusting his tie when, for a fleeting moment, something in his reflection made him stop. It wasn't something I could identify at first, just a flash, a shadow that seemed to move behind him, but when he turned his head, he saw nothing. He was alone. He didn't think much about it, attributing it to tiredness or lack of sleep. However, that night, while in the living room, he read an article on his mobile phone about strange phenomena in houses. The idea of the paranormal began to haunt his mind. The next time he passed by the hallway mirror, he saw the shadow again. This time it was more apparent, as if the figure of something was behind him, watching, stalking. But he did not move. Joseph took a deep breath, turned around, and found nothing but the normal reflection of his own face. From that day on, the shadow began to appear in every mirror in the house. On the bathroom mirror, on the small mirror on the dining table, on the mirror at the entrance of the house. It was always the same shadow, always following the same pattern, moving slowly, as if it had a life of its own. Each time Joseph looked at himself, the figure seemed to draw closer to him, as if it intended to reach him. At first, Joseph thought he was losing his mind. It was not possible. How could a shadow have a will of its own? And how could he move through each mirror in the house? But as the days went by, the shadow's behavior became stranger. In the bathroom mirror, he could see how the shadow seemed to lengthen, stretch towards him, as if he wanted to touch him. In the reflection of the hallway, the shadow was beginning to change shape. It was no longer just a dark outline. I could see how the shadow formed a human figure, but it was blurry, undefined. Jose began to feel observed. It didn't matter where I was inside the house. He could no longer escape his own gaze in the mirror, the shadow that stalked him from the reflections. Every time I walked into a room and saw the mirror, I could feel the shadow getting closer and closer. He was no longer sure if he was only seeing what his mind was suggesting to him, or if somehow that shadow was actually following him. One night, after having been at home all day, the shadow became more apparent than ever. As Joseph walked down the hall, he felt a presence behind him. It wasn't like other times, when she had felt that something strange was happening to her when she looked in the mirrors. This time, the feeling was more real. The shadow in the hallway mirror seemed to move on its own, swirling around him as if to catch him. Joseph backed away quickly, his heart pounding. He looked around, but there was nothing in the house that could explain it. He ran to the dining room looking for something that could make sense of it all. Fear began to take hold of him. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, he couldn't sleep. He decided to stay in the dining room without taking his eyes off the mirror. The shadow appeared again, sharper, more defined, drawing closer and closer to him. He was a human figure like a specter, but with something dark about his being. The shadow seemed to be breathing, waiting for the right moment to move forward. Jose could feel the air getting heavier around him. Fear invaded him completely. He decided that he had to do something. that he could not continue to live with that presence, with that figure that stalked him from the mirrors. But when he looked back into the hallway mirror, the shadow was closer than it had been before. This time, not only was he approaching, but he seemed to be moving towards him in a violent manner. Joseph felt his chest tighten, that something strange was happening. It was as if the shadow wanted to trap him, to possess him. Terrified, he tried to run out to the door, but before he could open it, the shadow materialized. He was no longer a mere figure reflected in mirrors. He had crossed over into the real world. Joseph could see the shadow take on human form, a disfigured-looking figure with empty eyes and an expression of anger and despair. The shadow surrounded him, and he, in his utter panic, couldn't move. Terror had paralyzed him. He wanted to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. The shadow began to whisper in his ear, incomprehensible words as if he were speaking to him in an ancient language, one that Joseph had never heard. Desperation invaded him completely. Fear had consumed him. He tried to back away, but he couldn't. The shadow kept him trapped. It was as if he were in an invisible prison that prevented him from escaping. The horror of what I was experiencing made everything even more real. The shadow not only followed him, now he touched him, brushed him with his cold hands, transmitting a feeling of pure evil. Joseph closed his eyes, trying to escape, but as he opened them, he realized that the shadow was completely above him. His hands were no longer cold but frozen, and they could feel him being dragged into the darkness from which he had emerged. Finally, the shadow absorbed him completely. There were no screams, no lights, no sign of life. Only the house remained silent. The mirror in the hallway, however, was still there, reflecting an empty image, that of an empty, gloomy room. From that day on, no one saw Joseph again. The house remained intact, but the mirrors never reflected the same again. In the hallway where Joseph had been trapped, the reflections were beginning to show a new figure, a shadow that moved slowly, waiting to be seen by the next one who dared to approach the mirror. The curse of reflection continued. In that home now there was only the echo of a dark presence silently waiting for the next victim to fall under its influence. No one knows what really happened to Joseph. What is clear is that, from that moment on, the shadows in the mirrors would never again be something innocent. Because sometimes what the glass reflects is not just a reflection, but something much more terrifying, something that can no longer be discarded by the human eye. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing, as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna? No, this can't be happening." he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something. "Anna, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. In the house, replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else, something he couldn't understand, something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else, and then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again, too much silence, as if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, And at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. The house was in absolute silence. The usual noises of everyday life had faded away, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. Rosa, the woman who lived in the house, walked through the halls with a feeling of discomfort that she could not shake. There was something strange about the air, something she couldn't identify, but that made her feel observed. The house had been his refuge for years, but lately everything had changed. Something felt out of place. One night, while Rosa was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a book, the sound came. It was a soft cry at first, almost imperceptible, as if it came from a distant place. But after a few minutes, the crying intensified, as if the child were closer. A shiver ran down his spine and his breathing became heavy. The crying was strange. It didn't sound like a child seeking comfort. There was something distorted about the sound, something that caused fear to take hold of her. Rosa stood up suddenly, throwing the book on the floor. He walked towards the door of the hallway, looking cautiously around. The crying seemed to be coming from a specific place, a room at the end of the hallway. An antique cupboard covered with a layer of dust was there, like a monument forgotten in time. The crying came from there, from inside that closet. Fear invaded her completely, but something pushed her to investigate. He approached slowly, with each step feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The closet door was closed, but the sound kept increasing in volume, heartbreaking, as if the boy was calling for help. Rosa, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, reached out to the handle of the closet. As he touched her, a shudder ran through her entire body, as if the door was being guarded by something invisible, something that didn't want her to enter. With a superhuman effort, he opened the door. Inside, everything was dark and dusty. There were no children, but the crying was still heard, louder than ever. A cold air emanated from inside the closet, freezing his bones instantly. Rosa stepped forward, her breathing fluttering and her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind caused the closet door to slam shut. Rosa turned around, terrified, but there was nothing. No children, no sound. Only the silence that had taken over the house again. However, fear was still nailed to his chest like an unbearable weight. She decided to go to her daughter's room to make sure she wasn't there, alone in the middle of the night. When she reached her door, something stopped her. A small whisper, almost inaudible, but enough to make his skin stand on end. He turned the knob and went in. His daughter slept soundly in his bed, his breathing calm. Rosa breathed a sigh of relief, but something was wrong. The boy in the closet couldn't be a dream. It couldn't be an illusion. There was something there, something I couldn't explain. The following days became stranger. Each night, the boy's cry seemed to resonate louder. Rosa tried to ignore him, thinking that perhaps he was imagining things. But every time she approached the closet, she felt a pressure in the air, as if she were being watched by something she couldn't see. A few days later, he decided to investigate further. She remembered that when she bought the house, the real estate agent had mentioned something about a former tenant who had mysteriously disappeared many years earlier. However, he never gave much importance to that story. Now I thought about it with a growing sense of horror. Rosa began to look for information about the history of the house. What she found left her speechless. The boy who had disappeared into the house was a little boy named Lucas, who had lived there with his mother. According to local legends, Lucas had died under strange circumstances, and his mother had disappeared shortly thereafter. No one had seen the woman again, but the boy, according to rumors, never stopped crying. His spirit was trapped in the house, and the cry of his lost soul could be heard every night. The truth struck Rosa with a force that left her paralyzed. The crying child was not a living child. It couldn't be. It was the spirit of Lucas, trapped in some corner of the house, seeking comfort, seeking peace. But I couldn't find it. Something had kept her soul trapped, and Rosa soon discovered that this thing was much darker than she imagined. One night, after hours of listening to the crying in her dreams, Rosa woke up suddenly. The crying no longer came only from the closet. Now it was all over the house, echoing around every corner. Rosa got up quickly, ran through the corridors, trying to find the origin of that terrifying sound. He came to the dining room, and there, in the center of the room, he saw a figure. The boy stood there, his face as pale as death, his eyes large and dark, and his body covered with dark spots that seemed to move of their own accord. The boy stared at her but said nothing. I just cried. The sense of terror that Rosa experienced was indescribable. He couldn't move. I was paralyzed. She didn't know if the boy saw her or if her soul was simply lost, trapped in a state of eternal despair. The crying grew louder, more piercing, and Rosa felt the pressure in her chest increase. The air was thick, heavy, and seemed to get colder and colder. The child's figure began to fade, but his crying did not stop. Instead, a dark shadow emerged from the ground, taking the form of a monstrous figure. Rosa tried to back up, but her legs didn't respond. The creature advanced toward her, its icy breath enveloping the room, its vacant gaze piercing her. The creature slowly approached, and Rosa could see that its eyes were not human eyes. They were two dark, empty orbs like an endless abyss. A scream formed in her throat, but terror consumed her completely. The figure lunged at her, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the shadow enveloped her body, taking her soul, carrying her into the depths of darkness. The boy had been just a disguise, a facade for a much older, much more evil entity that had been stalking the house for generations. Rosa couldn't escape. The house had claimed her soul, as it had done so many others before her. Since then, the house has remained silent once again. No one dared to approach her. Passers-by said that on dark nights, they could hear the cry of a child, mixed with the whispers of something else. Something that would never stop hovering in the shadows of that empty house, waiting for the next lost soul to fall into its traps. And so, the legend of the boy in the closet became a warning to all who approached the house. No one ever forgot the terror that dwelt in its walls. No one except those who had already become part of its history. Every night at exactly midnight, the sky darkened with a dense and heavy fog, while the first drops of the storm fell on the city. No one knew where they came from, or why they appeared so punctually. It seemed like a blessing at first, freshening the air and bringing relief to the sweltering warmth of the city. But as the days went by, the rain began to awaken something much darker, something that no one dared to understand. At 12 o'clock, the first drops fell gently, followed by a rain that intensified rapidly. No one dared to leave their homes when the sound of the storm began to fill everything. It was as if the rain had a life of its own, a being that felt strangely aware, as if it were watching. But the most disturbing feature of those rains was not only their arrival. They were the whispers. As the rain fell heavily, the wind rose, dragging with it voices, incomprehensible murmurs that ran through the empty streets. No one knew where they came from, but every night the whisper grew louder, closer, as if someone was right behind them, breathing into their necks. The figures also appeared, blurred shadows that faded when they were directly observed. Human silhouettes, but with an anomaly. Whenever they looked out into the rain, those figures would disappear into the mist, as if they had never been there. Still, everyone knew they were there, lurking in the dark. The first to notice something strange were the children. Small creatures that, without understanding the danger, played in the rain. But the laughter soon turned to terrified screams. Those who played near the storm began to see those figures, and some even swore they had touched them. They said that the sensation was as if the figures' hands were cold and wet, and when they touched them, they felt a pressure that made them shudder to the bone. Worst of all, when the children tried to run away, something stopped them. Their feet were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself were holding them back, as if an invisible force was dragging them back into the rain. That's when the city began to speak. The elders knew something. Everyone knew the legend, although no one dared to tell it out loud. They said that long before the city was founded, there was a small town that fell under a curse brought by an eternal storm that fell every midnight, bringing with it fear-feeding figures. No one could escape, and no one survived to tell what happened. The city had been built on the ruins of that village, but the rain, according to the elders, never went away. I had been waiting. One night, after several days in a row of heavy rains, a group of young people decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they drove into the center of the city, hoping to find a logical explanation. The rain began to fall with the same precision as always at 12 o'clock. As they walked through the deserted streets, the wind began to rustle. But this time it was different. The murmurs were not just whispers, they seemed like words that crept into their minds. At one point, one of the young men, Thomas, began to speak loudly, as if responding to someone. The others tried to stop him, but he kept walking, his eyes empty as if he were in a trance. "We can't escape. There's no way out," he murmured, his voice cracking with fear. "They are waiting for us. They are always here." The rain was falling harder now, and the murmurs turned into screams, distorted voices that filled the air with despair. The figures began to appear, gliding in the fog, slowly moving towards the group of young people. Some tried to flee, but their feet were no longer responding. Something was holding them back. Those who dared to look back saw those figures getting closer and closer, and although the shadows were vague, they could sense the presence of something much more sinister. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped in front of Thomas. His face was shrouded in shadows, but his silhouette was clear, a human figure standing in front of him. Thomas stretched out his hand as if he wanted to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed against the figure, a heart-rending scream filled the air, and the shadow vanished into the mist, leaving only the feeling of an icy hand taking hold of his heart. The others screamed as they saw Tomas fall to the ground, his body stiff, his face distorted by terror. No one could understand what had happened. They had tried to escape, but something kept them trapped in that place. The air was getting denser, as if the storm was absorbing all the light, leaving only a dense, heavy darkness that surrounded them completely. That's when they started to see something even more terrifying. Out of the shadows emerged hundreds, perhaps thousands of figures, all with the same empty faces, all approaching with frightening slowness. The shadows intertwined, forming a mass, as if they were united by an invisible force. The air was filled with whispers, murmurs of voices speaking in forgotten languages in low, guttural tones that penetrated the brain. Some of the young men tried to run again, but their bodies were no longer responding. They felt that the city itself was holding them back, that the ground was sticky, as if the earth was alive and dragging them in. The rain was falling harder, and the air smelled of dampness, of putrefaction. Suddenly, a large shadow emerged from the center of the city, larger than all the others. Its silhouette was huge, imposing, and seemed to be made of fog, but so dense that it seemed solid. "Fears are never forgotten," whispered a deep voice echoing through the air. "We have fed off the city for generations. This rain, this storm, is nothing more than a reminder of what we left behind." The young people, paralyzed by terror, could barely move a finger. The figure drew closer, and as he did so, the whispers increased, mingling with blood-curdling screams and sobs. There was no way to escape. The whole city seemed to be alive, breathing, stalking, waiting. Then, with one last whisper of despair, the young people were swallowed by the shadows. The figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and the rain stopped. At dawn, when the sunlight finally reached the city, everything seemed to be calm. But in the streets, on the walls of the buildings, there remained the marks of those who had disappeared, marks that would never fade. The midnight rain had claimed others, and the city, already lifeless, was left waiting for the next storm, the next victim. And each night, at exactly midnight, the drops began to fall once more, followed by the whispers and figures that were always there, waiting. It was a dark and cold night when, after hours of driving on desolate roads, David finally saw the lights of the forgotten hotel. He was alone on the journey, and the road seemed endless. The thick fog that covered the landscape gave him a sense of deep isolation, almost as if the world had disappeared. The hotel sign, covered in dust and rust, flickered faintly with the yellowish light coming from a lamp that seemed to be on the verge of going out. However, at that moment, David did not hesitate to stop his car. The cold penetrated his bones the instant he got out of the vehicle. There were no signs of life in the vicinity, only the sound of the wind blowing dry leaves. He walked slowly toward the hotel, feeling a strange writhing in his stomach, but forced himself to ignore it. He needed a place to rest, and this was the only establishment visible for miles around. As I entered, the atmosphere was charged with a silence so deep that it seemed to devour any sound. The reception was empty, but the door closed behind him with a thud, as if something was waiting that couldn't come out. The only light came from an old lamp that dimly illuminated a dusty staircase. Footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floor as he made his way to the counter. A peculiar-looking man appeared from the shadows. His face was pale, with sunken eyes and a strange smile that could not hide his discomfort. Despite his unsettling presence, the man was kind to offer him a room. "A single night, right?" he asked, his voice as soft as the whisper of the wind outside. David nodded, feeling the discomfort of not being able to see the receptionist's face well. He was handed the key to room 23, which appeared to be the only one available, and the man pointed to a door in the dark hallway. Without thinking too much, David headed there. As he walked, the feeling of discomfort grew, as if the corridors of the hotel were alive, watching him, waiting for something. The door to room 23 creaked as it opened. Inside, everything seemed to be covered in a layer of dust and dirt, but the bed, somewhat rickety, was made, which gave him a strange sense of tranquility. On the bedside table, an oil lamp emitted a soft light, as if someone had left everything in its place, ready to receive it. David put his backpack on the floor and sat up on the bed. He decided not to think about his thoughts anymore and lay down, staring at the ceiling as he listened to the incessant creaking of the wood under his weight. The wind was howling outside, but nothing seemed out of place, at least for now. Gradually, his eyes closed, but before he fell into a deep sleep, he heard something. A whisper. It seemed far away, perhaps coming from the corridor, but he did not give it importance. As the night wore on, the sound became clearer, more insistent. It was a low murmur, as if someone were speaking in a low voice, barely audible but constant. David tried to ignore it and covered his head with his pillow. However, what troubled him most was not the whisper, but the feeling that someone else was in the room with him. The next morning, he woke up sweating. He had had a vivid nightmare filled with shadows and echoes of voices surrounding him. The sunlight barely came through the windows, but he decided it would be best to get out of there as soon as possible. However, when trying to leave, something strange happened. The door to the room wouldn't open. He tried to turn the handle hard, but it wouldn't move. A cold sweat began to run down his forehead as he felt panic wash over him. Suddenly, a soft, distant laugh could be heard behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Fear caught up with him quickly, and his breathing quickened. He started banging on the door in desperation. But when he looked down, something caught his attention. On the ground, there were footprint marks as if someone had walked there. They were large and heavy, and seemed to vanish into thin air as if they had never existed. The atmosphere in the room felt denser, and a shudder ran through his body as he saw footprints begin to form around him. The door slammed open, leaving him with his heart racing and his body tense with fear. A dark corridor awaited him, a corridor where the shadows seemed to move strangely, as if they were watching his footsteps. He advanced cautiously, fearing what he might find, but when he reached the end of the hall, he saw a figure. A man standing in front of the window, staring out. The man was of a slim build with a gloomy face, and his figure seemed to emanate a sense of deep sadness. David approached, but the man did not move. When he was close enough, the man spoke without turning. "Did you stay overnight?" he asked, his voice soft, like a whisper lost in the wind. David nodded, not knowing what to answer. The man turned it around slowly, and that's when David saw it right. His face was marked by scars and wrinkles, but the worst thing was his empty gaze, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. The feeling of terror enveloped David, and he felt a shudder in his spine. "This hotel is full of shadows," the man continued. "Shadows of those who died here. No one leaves, no one escapes." David backed away, feeling the terror paralyze him. He wanted to flee, but his legs did not respond. The man began to walk toward him, and with each step, his body faded further until he became a shadow, an ethereal presence surrounding David. "You're going to stay here with us, just like the others." The room began to darken around him. The light from the oil lamp suddenly went out, and the corridor was filled with twisted shadows, figures floating aimlessly, slowly moving towards him. The feeling of despair enveloped him. He was no longer alone. The place became a prison, and the shadows of the people who had died there surrounded it. "This place never closes," whispered the shadow, "and you won't go out either." David tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. His whole body was paralyzed. The shadows enveloped him, and somehow he knew that his soul would be the next to be trapped forever. The doors of the hotel crashed shut, and the darkness consumed him completely. There were no more screams, only the eternal whisper of the lost souls that still wandered through the forgotten hotel. Daniel's apartment had always been his refuge, a place where the stillness of the night offered him the calm he needed so much after a tiring day. A space where shadows seemed to whisper secrets that only lonely people could understand. He had lived alone for years after the separation from his wife, and although loneliness sometimes overwhelmed him, he had learned to live with her. Life had lost its luster, but at least it remained stable. One night, as he was getting ready for sleep, Daniel noticed something strange. The digital clock light, which always flickered in the darkness of his room, seemed even dimmer than usual. Everything in the apartment was the same. The furniture in place, the TV off, the fresh air seeping through the cracks in the window. Everything seemed normal, but there was something unsettling in the air. Something I couldn't identify. He settled under the covers and closed his eyes, waiting for the dream to come as usual. However, that night something different happened. A whisper, low and barely audible, seeped into his consciousness. He thought it was a dream at first, but when he tried to ignore it, the voice became clearer, closer. Daniel. The sound of his name, so clear in the gloom, made his skin crawl. It couldn't be possible. No one else was there. He got up quickly, looking around, but the apartment was empty, in complete silence. Even so, the voice persisted, slipping into his mind. Daniel, you know what you did. A shiver ran down his spine. His heart began to pound, pounding his chest like a frantic drum. What was this? It couldn't be a hallucination. The voice sounded real, tangible, as if someone was in the room with him. He looked around, but there was nothing that could justify what he was hearing. The voice continued, this time with a deeper, more hissing tone, as if coming from the walls themselves. You know what you did, and they will remind you. Daniel turned on the light from the bedside lamp, looking for a logical explanation. A dream? No, this was different. The feeling in his stomach was that of a real, palpable threat. The voice, although he couldn't see where it was coming from, seemed to come from everywhere at once. He tried to calm down, but the words echoed in his mind like an endless echo. The next morning, Daniel tried to ignore what he had experienced. He told himself that it had been just a nightmare, a manifestation of his tired mind. But that same night, when darkness took over her apartment again, the voice returned, stronger this time. I'm watching you, I always have. Daniel got out of bed with instinctive speed, feeling that the temperature in the room had dropped drastically. The air became dense, heavy, as if the space was narrowing around him. There was no rational explanation that could be offered for what was happening, and fear began to take hold of him. He wondered if his sanity was beginning to crumble, if he was losing control of his mind. Who are you? He shouted, his voice trembling. The answer came in a whisper, but this time it was different. The voice not only spoke, but seemed to come from inside his own head, like an alien thought invading his personal space. You know what I did, don't you? How did you forget me so easily? The words struck his mind with such force that he fell to his knees. The voice seemed to come from a place I couldn't comprehend. His thoughts became cloudy and the sense of panic intensified. Doubt began to sow deep roots in his mind. He remembered the separation with his ex-wife, the decisions he made, the mistakes he made. But none of that seemed enough to justify the terror he felt. An idea began to form, with fear taking over his thoughts. Could this voice, this entity, be something related to his past? Something I had tried to escape from all those years? But the voice seemed to know everything, more than he wanted to admit. The next night, as darkness fell on the apartment, the voice returned with overwhelming insistence. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He picked up his phone and called a friend, but the call dropped before he could say anything. Panic overwhelmed him. He was alone, completely alone. Daniel, do you want to know the price of your decisions? The room was cold, the air thick and stuffy, as if he were drowning in the presence of something he could not see. The furniture, the walls, the ceiling seemed to close in on him. Each shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the light from the lamp flickered faintly. The voice began to laugh, a low, guttural laugh seeping into his brain. The feeling that something was watching him, lurking around him, became unbearable. Daniel felt as if something was dragging him along, something dark that took hold of his soul, squeezing it, making him relive his worst fears. You can't escape. You never can. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were slow, heavy steps, as if someone were walking with deliberate calm, approaching his door. Daniel's mind began to fragment. The voice continued to whisper, but he could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that had taken hold of his mind. He got out of bed, but his legs didn't respond well. Anxiety dominated him. His breathing was agitated, and fear had paralyzed him. When he tried to open the door to get out, something stopped him. The door was locked from the outside, and a cold, invisible hand seemed to hold it firmly. "You know what you did. Remember?" The voice was much closer now. Terror seized him. His mind struggled to find a way out, but the shadows, thicker and denser, seemed to close in on him. He couldn't run away from his own darkness, from his own memories, from the decisions he'd made that were now in some way condemning him. Suddenly, the door opened with a blood-curdling creak. Daniel took a step back, watching in horror as the figure of a woman appeared at the entrance. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his face was a mask of pain and suffering. The woman walked toward him with terrifying slowness, as if every step she took was a sentence. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" It was as if the voice that had been harassing him for so long had finally taken shape. The woman in front of him seemed to be a manifestation of his own demons, his own guilt. Fear completely paralyzed him as the figure advanced toward him. He tried to scream, but his throat was closed and he couldn't make a sound. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" The voice repeated, this time louder, deeper, more terrifying. With a cry of despair, Daniel fell to the ground, his mind finally collapsing under the weight of the terror that had haunted him for so long. The woman leaned over him, her empty eyes fixed on his, and at that moment, Daniel understood. She was his ex-wife. The figure stared at him, smiling with an expression that mixed sadness and revenge. Before he could react, darkness completely enveloped him, and the last thing he heard was his own voice, whispering from somewhere inside his mind, "I told you. You can't escape." The room fell silent and the light went out. The shadows returned to the place where they had always been, but this time the dark presence had won. Daniel never woke up. The antique shop was hidden in a narrow, dusty street, almost impossible to find if you didn't know exactly where to look. The display cases were full of dusty objects, old and forgotten in appearance, which had survived the passage of time without being appreciated, destined to fall into the oblivion of future generations. However, in the midst of the darkness of that store, there was a piece that seemed to glow with a subtle yet unsettling glow. Gabriel, a young art collector, had come to the shop after hearing rumors about an old painting that was said to have an intriguing history. The owner of the shop, an older man with an enigmatic look, received him in silence and led him to the back, where, on an easel, was the painting that had attracted Gabriel's attention. It was a medium-sized painting, with a scene showing a family gathered around a table. The painting was beautiful, with impeccable technique, but there was something about people's faces that I couldn't decipher. Something in those empty eyes and that frozen expression troubled him deeply. The background was gloomy, as if a thick dark fog was sliding across the scene, enveloping everything in an air of despair. Gabriel couldn't help but feel a strange attraction to painting. Although his friends and colleagues at the art gallery warned him, something inside him told him that the piece should be his. The price asked by the old owner seemed derisory for a work of such quality, and despite the old man's non-verbal warning, Gabriel did not hesitate to make the purchase. Once at home, the painting was carefully placed on the main wall of the living room, right in front of the fireplace. That same night after dinner, Gabriel sat in front of the painting, observing the details, trying to understand what made the work unsettling about it. The image attracted him, enveloped him, as if the painted figures were trying to speak to him, to call him to something beyond the canvas. The first change occurred during the early morning, when moonlight filtered through the windows and reflected on the canvas. Gabriel, still awake, stood up at the sound of a slight creak, as if the painting itself were moving. He looked up at the wall where the paint seemed to have changed slightly. The figures in the painting were no longer in the same posture. The woman who was sitting on the right of the table, smiling at the painting, now seemed to be staring at Gabriel. His eyes had become darker, deeper, as if that woman's gaze was watching him directly through the painting. A shiver ran down Gabriel's spine. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, thinking that perhaps the light and shadow played tricks on his eyes. But as the days went by, the alterations in the painting became more noticeable. Every night the scene was modified, albeit in a subtle way. The faces in the painting were beginning to show more distressed expressions. The figure of the man in the center, which at first seemed a reassuring figure, began to distort. His face lengthened, as if the painting were taking on a life of its own. Gabriel began to notice that, Even though the figures seemed inert during the day, every time he turned off the lights, the eyes of the characters in the painting seemed to move towards him. One night, while studying the painting, something even stranger happened. The scene was completely altered. The painting family was no longer gathered around the table. Instead, the characters seemed to be facing each other, their faces disfigured by terror. The man in the center of the table seemed to be screaming, but he made no sound. The figures were surrounded by a thick fog, as if the painting itself was being swallowed by something dark and ominous. Gabriel felt trapped in a nightmare. He began to see shadowy figures reflected on the surface of the canvas. I couldn't take my eyes off the painting, but at the same time I felt a growing sense of anguish. He decided to research the history of the painting, looking for any clue as to its origin. However, what he found only plunged him further into mystery. There were no records of that work, nor of the family portrayed in it. The only thing he could find was a hidden note on the back of the painting that read, "Darkness takes away what it touches." This note, written in an ancient calligraphy, appeared to be marked with a red stain, as if it were blood. One afternoon, when returning from work, Gabriel found the painting completely changed. The scene had advanced. Now it showed the characters in what seemed an even more disturbing scenario. A fire was burning behind the family, consuming the scene in total chaos. The woman's figure, which at first seemed to be the calmer figure, was now wide-eyed, her hands raised as if trying to scream, but not audibly. Gabriel was indescribably attracted to painting, but at the same time an unbearable terror seized him. One night, as I was looking at the painting through a dim light, something worse happened. The figures began to move in the painting. The woman on the right, the one who originally looked so calm, slowly raised her hand to the surface of the painting. Gabriel took a step back, trembling. A shrill scream echoed through his head, a sound of despair and pain. Suddenly, the woman's figure began to slowly fade away, as if she was being absorbed by the fire at the bottom. Every time I looked at the painting, something else changed, something creepier. The characters were no longer only horrified, but seemed to be suffering, as if the painting was taking their lives. Gabriel began to feel a presence, something that slipped behind him, watching him as he looked at the painting. I couldn't escape that feeling that I wasn't alone. Then something even more terrifying happened. During one of his sleepless nights, Gabriel woke up with a feeling of tightness in his chest. He looked at the painting and saw something he had never imagined. One of the figures in the painting, the man sitting at the table, had disappeared. Instead, he was himself staring from the canvas. The painting had captured him. Terror seized him. Gabriel tried to move away, but his eyes could not stop looking at the painting. The man in the painting, now with his face distorted, began to slowly move towards the edge of the painting, as if he was trying to break through the canvas. Gabriel jumped up, but the figures began to lengthen and twist, emitting whispers that echoed in his mind. The worst of all was when one of the figures began to call him by his name. Gabriel heard clearly the whisper of his own voice emerging from the painting. "Gabriel, come here." The feeling of despair completely invaded him. His mind became cloudy, and fear consumed him. He ran to the door, but when he tried to open it, the painting seemed to come to life. His eyes full of terror looked at him, and he felt that he was being pursued. The figure of the man in the painting, now with a macabre grin, began to stretch towards him, as if trying to reach for him. Gabriel could not escape that oppressive atmosphere. The man in the painting drew nearer and nearer until, with a last cry, he disappeared from the canvas, leaving only the dense fog that enveloped the scene. Suddenly, everything in the room went dark. Painting was no longer just an image on the canvas. Gabriel could no longer distinguish between the real world and the painting, as if the painting had completely absorbed him. Fear, terror, and despair surrounded him, as he watched the scene of the painting slowly unravel, taking with it the only reality he knew. The painting had served its purpose. In the depths of an ancient monastery, surrounded by impenetrable jungle, stood a forgotten reliquary, jealously guarded for centuries by a community of monks. No one knew of its existence except for a select few who, for generations, were in charge of protecting the object that was said to possess supernatural powers. Legend claimed that the reliquary was a container of curse, which had been sealed with spells so dark that anyone who dared to open it would fall into eternal damnation. Over the centuries, many had tried to find it, but none returned, and the monastery fell into oblivion. Today, a renowned archaeologist named Gabriel Vasquez, obsessed with unraveling the secrets of antiquity, arrived at the monastery. He had heard rumors about the reliquary, and the idea that its existence might be linked to humanity's ancient rituals and dark powers drew him in with irresistible force. Despite the warnings of his colleagues who told him about the disappearances of those who had searched for the reliquary, Gabriel decided to undertake the search. His greed to uncover the truth blinded him to danger, and he resolutely ventured deep into the jungle. As he went, the warning signs became clearer. Ruins that had never been documented appeared before his eyes, covered in strange symbols that seemed to move in the gloom, whispering unintelligible words. Gabriel felt a growing sense of anxiety, but his curiosity kept him steadfast. He had come too far to give up now. When he finally arrived at the monastery, he found the building in ruins, covered in weeds, but its structure still stood, almost defiant in the face of the passage of time. Inside, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, and a heavy air of desolation permeated every corner. The monks who had cared for him for centuries were gone, but something remained, something sinister. Gabriel could feel it, a tug in his chest, as if a presence was watching him, waiting. He went into the heart of the monastery, an ancient room that seemed untouched by man in centuries. In the center of the room, on an altar covered with dust, rested the reliquary. It was a small object, but it emanated a dense, dark energy, as if it were alive. Gabriel, feeling a mixture of fear and fascination, could not resist the temptation to approach. As he took the locket in his hands, a wave of cold ran through his body. The whispers in the air intensified, and the room seemed to become even darker. However, Gabriel couldn't stop looking at him. At that moment, a spark of doubt crossed his mind, but greed overpowered him. He opened the locket. From that moment on, the world around him changed. Shadows that were once static began to move, taking on distorted and grotesque shapes. A dark figure emerged from the gloom, its red eyes glowing with an evil intensity. It was the spirit of an ancient monk, whose soul had been trapped in the reliquary for centuries, doomed to wander among the plains of the world of the living and the dead. The spirit began to whisper words in a forgotten language, and Gabriel felt his soul tremble, as if the words themselves pierced his mind. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and its red eyes locked onto Gabriel's. A sense of indescribable horror came over him. He could feel the cold presence of death beside him, a death that watched him, waiting. The ground began to shake, and Gabriel backed away, terrified. The walls closed around him, as if the monastery were alive, trying to devour him. With each step back, the whispers became more intense, more urgent. Gabriel tried to flee, but the doors of the monastery closed with a deafening roar, and a dark shadow surrounded him completely. His breathing became erratic, and his mind began to wander. He was no longer alone. He felt presences around him, dark figures watching him in silence, waiting for his fall. The monk's spirit was advancing toward him, an invisible force pressing on his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. The darkness surrounded him, consumed him, and Gabriel could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that was unleashed around him. As the darkness advanced, Gabriel could hear a wail, as if the very walls of the monastery were weeping in agony. The monks who had guarded the reliquary, those who had sacrificed themselves to seal it, were now rising from their graves. Their rotting bodies walked through the shadows, crawling toward him, as if trapped in a prison of eternal death, seeking revenge for the breaking of the seal that had kept the dark forces at bay for centuries. Gabriel tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat as if something was strangling him. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The terror had completely paralyzed him, and all he could do was look around while the shadows closed in on him. The monk's spirit drew closer, and Gabriel could feel the coldness of his breath on his neck. The last whisper he heard was that of a warning. Death is never forgotten. Death never forgives. Suddenly, a flash of blinding light enveloped him, and the monastery began to crumble around him. The shadows, the figures, everything disintegrated, and the room was plunged into absolute silence. Gabriel was in the center of a dark void, floating in the abyss, without a body, without a soul. The reliquary had served its purpose. He had claimed what belonged to him. And so, the legend of the reliquary of death was fulfilled. No one else would attempt to challenge the limits of the cursed object. The locket, now empty, was sealed again, waiting for its next challenger, its next soul to consume. The Fernandez family had been looking for the perfect house for months, a spacious home in a place away from the noise of the city, surrounded by nature. When they finally found the ancient mansion, located deep in the forest, they couldn't believe their luck. Despite the somewhat worn appearance, the price was unbeatable. Who else would want to live in such an isolated place? The mansion, with its solid wood doors, high windows, and glass ceilings, looked like something out of another time. The place, although somewhat dark and covered in moss, had an elegance that immediately captivated them. As they walked through its corridors, the family felt that they were entering an old tale. There was something mysterious about its walls, as if every corner kept a hidden history, something they didn't dare to ask. The silence in the house was almost palpable, as if the whole place breathed in a deep, ancient way. Within days of moving, strange things began to happen. The youngest daughter, Clara, was the first to notice something strange. One afternoon, as he explored the second floor, he heard a distant echo, as if someone had whispered his name from deep within the house. At first she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but when she told her parents, they took her as a joke. However, Clara could not shake the feeling that the house was talking to her, as if it were alive. One night, after a quiet dinner, the echoes grew stronger. Clara, unable to sleep, got up in the middle of the night and went to the main living room, where the fireplace no longer crackled, and the moonlight barely filtered through the curtains. As he walked down the dark hall, he suddenly heard his mother's voice clearly. It was a trembling whisper, calling to her from the back of the house. He ran to the place where the voice came from, but when he arrived, he found everything silent. His mother slept soundly in her room, oblivious to any disturbance. Clara, terrified, began to doubt what she had heard, but the fear in her chest was real. He decided to tell his parents everything the next morning. The family tried to rationalize the strange events. The father, Luis, thought that perhaps the isolation of the house was affecting everyone's mind, but when one night, after a particularly hot day, the house began to creak, terror took hold of them. The sound came from the walls. At first it was just a soft crack, but then it morphed into an increasingly loud and sinister sound. It was as if something was pushing the walls from within. One night, as everyone was trying to sleep, the echoes began to resonate louder than ever. Luis woke up with a start and went out into the hallway, where he discovered that the house was full of echoes, but they were not common voices. It seemed as if someone was whispering incomplete sentences, unintelligible words, as if the walls were repeating the secrets of the former owners. The echoes became clearer and clearer, and began to form words that, although incomplete, gave a feeling of indescribable discomfort. Luis, restless, began to investigate the history of the mansion. He found that the previous family had lived there for generations, but what surprised him most was the fact that none of them had survived the house. They had all moved, but something had forced them back, something dark and persistent. No one had ever grown old living in that house. Each member of the family had died young, mysteriously. The house seemed to devour the lives of those who dared to inhabit it. Luis began to suspect that the echoes they heard were not just sounds from the past, but were the voices of those who had lived and died in the mansion. The walls not only whispered their secrets, they retained them. There was something evil about that place, something that trapped souls and held them prisoner. One night, Clara couldn't take it anymore. She ran out of her room, disoriented, as if she were being called by something invisible. She ran through the halls, the echoes following her, calling her name over and over again. When he reached the main hall, he stopped in his tracks. In front of her, in the mirror on the wall, she saw a figure. It was his mother, but his eyes were empty, hollow, as if the woman he saw was but a shadow of his former self. The figure smiled in a strange, twisted way, while his lips formed words that Clara could not understand. Terror invaded her, but she could not move, as if the house had trapped her in that very place. In the distance, the echoes began to rise, louder, clearer, until they became desperate cries. They were the voices of the former inhabitants of the mansion, calling for help, warning that it was too late. Luis came running to the classroom when he heard Clara's scream, but what he found left him paralyzed. There was no trace of her. Only the resounding echo of his name remained, repeating itself on the walls. In desperation, Luis tried to call the police, but in doing so, he discovered that the phone lines in the house were cut. No one outside that place could hear them. The family realized they were no longer alone. Something dark had awakened in the mansion, something that was not only watching them but was slowly devouring them. No one could escape the echoes that filled the house, which resounded louder and louder, like a sentence that never ended. As the weeks passed, the family began to fall apart. The echoes not only caught their voices, but also their minds. Their memories became distorted. Their emotions became erratic. Luis began to lose his sense of reality, and his wife, Anna, seemed to become more and more distant, as if trapped in an endless dream. Clara, for her part, did not stop listening to her mother's voice calling her, urging her to join her in a world where the limits of life and death did not exist. Finally, on a particularly dark night, the echoes peaked. The house itself seemed to breathe, and the shadows on the walls began to take shape. The former residents of the mansion materialized before them, and as their screams echoed through the air, the Fernandez family finally understood what it meant to live in that house. It wasn't just a home, it was a prison with no way out, where trapped souls would never stop suffering. The family, already consumed by terror, never managed to escape. At the dawn of a day that never came, the mansion was empty again, but the echoes continued to resound like a warning to those who dared to approach. The House of the Echoes finally had claimed its last victim. St. Brace's University had witnessed hundreds of stories, from the early days of its founding to the modern era. Its Gothic architecture, with its towering towers and dark corridors, inspired both respect and fear. No one really knew every corner of campus. The oldest spoke of forgotten corridors, locked doors, and underground passages that led to places that should never be discovered. Thomas, a young history student, had heard many of these stories in the hallways, whispered quietly by his older classmates. Like many others, he considered them mere legends, nothing more than ghost tales that served to scare new ones. But there was something different about him, an insatiable curiosity to unveil the secrets of the past. So when he came across an old key in a dusty corner of the library one day, he couldn't help but be drawn to it. The key looked old, as if it belonged to an object forgotten centuries ago. No one seemed to recognize her, and this only added to the mystery surrounding her. That afternoon, as he walked around campus, his mind kept spinning over that key. He felt a strange connection to her, as if something was calling him. It was then that, while walking near the east side of the university, he noticed something peculiar, a small corridor that he had never seen before. Although he knew every corner of the place well, it seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The walls covered in ivy and mold, and the dim light that filtered through the broken windows made it seem like a place lost in time. Deep within that hallway, the atmosphere felt dense, as if the air itself was charged with dark energy. Tomas's heart was pounding as he walked down the hallway, key in hand, as if he'd been waiting all his time to get to that place. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and the echo seemed to follow him as if the corridor were alive and watching. At the end of the corridor, a solid wooden door, covered with dust and cobwebs, stood before him. Something inside him knew that was where he should use the key. As he inserted the key into the lock, a strange whisper rose into the air, almost inaudible at first, but growing with each turn of the key. It was as if someone was whispering his name, calling to him from beyond the door. Sweat began to trickle down his forehead as the door slowly opened, revealing a dark room, a room that had been closed for generations. As he crossed the threshold, Thomas was overcome by a sensation of intense cold, which ran down his spine and froze his bones. The walls were covered with strange symbols which seemed to move as he watched them. The air in the room was dense, as if the atmosphere itself was polluted by something ancient, something that had been waiting a long time to be discovered. In the distance, in the center of the room, an old wooden table was surrounded by broken chairs, and on the table a closed book seemed to be waiting for him. Thomas cautiously approached the book, feeling the weight of the story and the mystery that surrounded it. With trembling hands, he opened the book, only to find pages covered in red ink, as if they had been written in blood. The words in the book did not seem to form coherent sentences, but were fragments that spoke of rituals, of dark pacts, and of a presence that lived in the halls of the university, waiting for the right moment to reclaim those who dared to discover its existence. As he read, a strange feeling of dizziness came over him. Whispers that had previously been barely perceptible were now clearly audible. Voices coming from everywhere, but I couldn't identify where they came from. The voices called him by name, whispering promises and warnings. He felt as if something was watching him from the shadows, as if something was waiting for him to make a mistake, something that could condemn him. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The corridor behind him seemed to have lengthened, and the door through which he had entered was no longer visible. He saw only darkness, a black chasm expanding before him. At that instant, a loud noise made him spin. Something was moving quickly towards him, a whisper that transformed into a guttural, inhuman scream full of rage. Fear invaded him completely, but he could not move. He was paralyzed, trapped in a labyrinth of darkness and terror. Cold fingers landed on his shoulder and his body reacted immediately, giving him a shudder that made him take a step back. He turned, but no one was there. Just the echo of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. However, the air was charged with an invisible presence surrounding him. The voices intensified, and they began to speak in a language that he did not understand, but that resonated deep within his being. His eyes widened as the figure of a woman appeared in front of him, her face haggard, her eyes empty of emotion, but filled with infinite sadness. Thomas tried to scream, but his throat didn't respond, as if something was choking him from the inside. The woman began to walk towards him, and with every step she took, the ground shook slightly. When he was in front of him, his lips moved slowly, but the words did not reach his ear. It was not a human language, but something more primitive, something that belonged to a lost age. Suddenly, Thomas felt a pressure on his chest, as if the air itself was crushing him. The woman stretched out her hand towards him, and at that instant the lights came back on, but the room was completely transformed. I was no longer in the dark and dusty place, but in an ethereal space outside of time, where everything looked distorted, as if the world itself was broken. It was as if he had been transported to a place that did not belong to reality. The voices surrounded him, and now he could see them. Shadows of human figures, all with the same empty and sad expressions, all whispering but not saying anything he could understand. The shadows closed in on him, and as they surrounded him, an excruciating pressure took over his mind. He wanted to scream, but the words choked in his throat. Finally, the woman spoke, and this time her words were clear, though filled with overwhelming darkness. The corridor is alive. It always has been. All those who have crossed its doors have been claimed. And now, it's your turn. Panic took hold of him, but he couldn't move. The darkness surrounded him, and the voices called to him, full of despair, of pain. The hallway had been created to trap curious souls, to keep them trapped in an endless cycle. And now Thomas had become part of that cycle. The woman, now a shadowy figure, looked at him with infinite sadness, as if she were sorry. The hallway was never a physical place. It was a threshold, a line between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and once crossed, there was no turning back. Tomas never returned. The whispering hall closed behind him, and the voices died away, leaving only the echo of his lost existence. The mystery of St. Bryce's University continued, and the legends about the forgotten corridor grew more somber. No one else dared to look for that hallway, but those passing by swore they heard whispers, as if the hallway was waiting for the next victim. In an ancient city marked by the shadows of time and cobbled streets, there was a gallery in which the most extravagant art collectors looked for unique pieces, objects that transcended mere aesthetics and the whims of fashion. It was a gallery that was not easily found. Only those with a true passion for the macabre and the strange knew of its existence. On a dark, foggy night, a man named Nicholas Hernandez, an art collector known for his obsession with the unusual, arrived at that hidden gallery. From the first moment he walked in, he knew something wasn't right. The walls, of a grayish and opaque color, were covered with paintings that seemed to observe him. The eyes on the paintings followed him, no matter where he was headed. However, it was one particular work that captured his attention. An old painting, framed with aged and weathered wood, stood isolated on a wall, as if waiting to be seen. The image was disturbing. It showed a human figure, a woman in the middle of a desolate and gloomy landscape. Around him, dark beings seemed to stalk him, shadows of what might have been people or something far stranger. The painting had a strange, almost tangible energy, as if the figure on the canvas was alive, waiting to be released. The owner of the gallery, an old man with eyes that seemed to hide dark secrets, approached Nicholas without saying a word, but his gaze invited him closer to the painting. "It's a rare piece," the old man murmured, his voice raspy and deep. "Of an artist who disappeared years ago. Some say that painting has life, that whoever owns it will become part of it. The comment, far from frightening Nicholas, aroused his curiosity even more. Throughout his career as a collector, he had seen all kinds of disturbing paintings, but there was something special about this one, not only because of its artistic quality, but also because of the feeling that something in the painting breathed, something that did not belong to the physical world. "How much does it cost?" asked Nicholas, already determined to possess her. The old man smiled with a grimace that seemed more like a warning than a sign of satisfaction. "It's not about money. Only those who are destined to possess it can do so. If you really want this painting, you should know that the price is not what it seems." Nicholas, impatient and blinded by his desire, nodded without question. The old man gestured for her to follow him, and once outside the gallery, handed him the painting without further words. Back home, Nicholas placed the painting in the main room of his mansion. The image of the woman in the dark landscape seemed to change according to the light, as if the characters in the background were moving slowly, like shadows sliding across the painting. As the days went by, Nicholas began to notice that he couldn't stop looking at her. He felt attracted to her, as if something invisible was calling him to observe her more closely, as if the woman's figure was watching him. One night, as I sat in front of the painting, an inexplicable chill began to run through the room. The woman's figure seemed to come to life, her face distorted into an expression of anguish. Nicholas felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. Characters who were previously shadows in the background now moved more clearly. The eyes of the woman in the painting seemed full of despair, as if she were trapped in that landscape waiting for someone to free her. As the days passed, the effects of the painting intensified. Nicholas began to hear whispers in the house. Distant voices, which I could not identify, murmured from the darkness. Sometimes, when he walked through the mansion, he thought he saw the figures in the painting moving behind him, always out of his field of vision. Every time he tried to turn away from the painting, a sense of discomfort came over him, as if something was watching him from the shadows. One afternoon, Nicholas woke up in his chair in front of the painting as if he hadn't slept in days. The eyes of the woman in the painting no longer showed despair, but a cold indifference. But the scariest thing was what he saw in the background. The dark figures in the painting had approached. They were no longer just shadows. Now they were complete figures, with grotesque and deformed faces, whose eyes shone with an evil light. Nicholas tried to get up, but something was holding him in place. His body was unresponsive. He was trapped, as if the paint had absorbed him. Desperation took hold of him. He screamed, but his voice did not come out. Around him, the figures in the painting began to move faster, getting closer and closer. He could feel their presences beside him, as if his hands were touching him, brushing against him coldly. Nicholas was trapped in a world within the painting, a dimension of horror and anguish. I couldn't escape, I couldn't get out. He could only watch, helpless, as the shadows surrounded him. Panic gripped his soul. He looked at the woman's figure, but she was no longer a mere image. It was in front of him, his face transformed into a distorted grimace of suffering. The woman stared at him, and in her eyes, Nicholas saw the same despair he felt. She had been caught up in that world as well, and now he was destined to take her place. At that moment, Nicholas understood the truth. Not only did the painting come to life, it absorbed those who possessed it, trapping them in its dark and distorted realm. The figures in the background were now completely distorted shapes, with no clear faces, just bright eyes watching Nicholas as they dragged him into the darkness. He tried to scream, but he couldn't anymore. His body was disappearing, crumbling as if it were part of the painting. His skin melted into the colors of the canvas, and his muscles were transformed into patches of pigment. Nicholas, the collector who had wanted to own the work, was no longer human. He had been absorbed by painting, his soul condemned to live eternally in that world of shadows. In the gallery, the painting had changed. The woman's figure was now accompanied by the figure of Nicholas, her face disfigured into an expression of horror and despair. The figures in the background were still lurking, always watching, always waiting for the next unwary person to become part of their world. Painting, once a simple work of art, was now a portal to a distorted reality, where trapped souls lived in endless torment. And so, the cursed painting kept waiting, waiting for the next collector, waiting for someone else to fall into its trap, to be consumed by the terror and obsession that emanated from its colors. No one would ever know the full story, only that those who stared too long at the painting, those who obsessed over it, ended up being swallowed by the darkness it contained. In that dark and gloomy corner of art, shadows were always waiting, and painting, always thirsting for souls, would never fail to attract the unwary who got too close. The cold morning air seemed to envelop them in a thick mist that slid through the trees like an entity unto itself. The group of friends, 5 in all, were slowly advancing along the path that led them to the heart of the forest. Every step they took was accompanied by the rustling of dry leaves beneath their feet, a sound that seemed to be amplified in the absolute silence around them. Carlos, the most enthusiastic of the group, led the way with a flashlight in his hand, his face illuminated by the warm light that contrasted with the gray of the landscape. Behind him was Lucia, his best friend, followed by Eduardo, Javier, and Laura. Everyone, gasping for breath, stood together, looking straight ahead, where the forest seemed to grow denser with each step. "Are you sure this is the house?" Lucia asked, with a tone that denoted a certain fear, although she tried to hide it. "Of course," Carlos replied with a confident smile. "I have checked it. I've been here before, but I never dared to go in. Today will be different." Eduardo, always the most skeptical, raised an eyebrow, looking at the shadows that seemed to move in the distance among the trees. Fog enveloped everything around him, but the treetops revealed flashes of light that made the scene look surreal. "I don't like this," Eduardo murmured, but no one paid any attention to him. The group continued to move forward, ignoring the weight of fear that seemed to follow them, watching them at every step. Finally, after several minutes walking in silence, they arrived at a small clearing. There, hidden among the trees, was the house. The structure was old, with broken windows and wooden walls that showed the passage of time and decay. The house, however, seemed to have something that made it stand out from the rest of the landscape, a palpable energy, as if the whole place was charged with something dark, something ancient. The door of the house was ajar, which increased the bewilderment of the friends. "This isn't right," said Laura, who had always been the most cautious of the group. His eyes swept over the doorway and his stomach churned. Despite her fear, curiosity drove her to take a step forward. "It's okay," Carlos insisted, pushing the door effortlessly. "It's just an abandoned house. Surely there is only dust and cobwebs. Come on, let's go in." The group looked around. The trees, though imposing, could not hide the fact that something strange was happening in that place. The feeling of being watched did not disappear, but intensified. But the excitement of exploring the interior of the house overcame their instincts, and one by one they entered the hall. The air inside the house was heavy, dense, as if time itself had stopped there. The walls were covered with dark stains that, at first, were thought to be simple marks of moisture. However, as they progressed, something else became apparent. In the shadows of the main room, blurred figures could be seen, as if they were watching them from the corners, waiting. Carlos turned off the lantern and, with an expression that tried to hide his discomfort, whispered, "Let's explore a little more. Surely there is nothing." At first all seemed calm, though a sense of uneasiness hung over them. Every step echoed in the void, and the echo of their voices was lost in the heavy air. But soon, a series of strange noises began to fill everything. A crunch here, a whisper there. Lucy shuddered and looked at the others, trying to see their faces, but the darkness had completely enveloped them. Eduardo took out his mobile phone to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered before turning off completely. "What the hell?" Eduardo growled, rubbing his eyes as if trying to clear the fog from his mind. It was then that a sound coming from the upper floor broke the absolute silence. A dull thud followed by something that seemed to be dragging on the floor. Lucia, visibly pale, gritted her teeth. "I don't like this," he said in a trembling voice. "There's something about this house, something that's not right." Carlos ignored her and began to climb the stairs, determined to explore. With each step, the sound of the creaking of the old wooden floor became more and more unbearable. Javier and Laura followed him closely, with fear marking his every move. Edward, for his part, remained in the hall, looking nervously at the shadows that stretched on the walls. Fear overwhelmed him, but he did not want to be the first to abandon the expedition. Upon reaching the second floor, the group found themselves in a long hallway, where open doors gave way to empty rooms. However, something else caught his attention. A room at the end of the hallway was closed with a rusty door that seemed to have remained intact despite the years. Curiosity, mixed with the growing sense of dread, pushed them closer. When they opened the door, an icy air enveloped them, as if time had frozen at that very moment. Inside, an ancient full-length mirror reflected their distorted images, as if they were seeing something that didn't belong there. Lucia's eyes widened as she saw a shadowy figure reflected in the glass. But when she turned, there was nothing behind her. The silence became absolute. The fear grew, and the shadow seemed to stretch all over the room, as if somehow the house itself wanted to devour them. "It's time to go," Eduardo said, his voice firm but nervous. He had had enough. However, before he could take a step back, the door slammed shut, leaving them trapped inside. The light from their flashlights flickered, and the sound of something heavy creeping in again was heard louder. Suddenly, an evil presence became apparent. Something ancient and powerful had been waiting, watching, and now at last it had decided to show itself. The air became denser, and the darkness around them began to come alive. A dull scream could be heard in the distance, the sound of something that was not human, something that had been part of that house long before they arrived. The walls seemed to shrink, the house creaked, and friends began to feel the pressure on their breasts, as if they were being crushed by an invisible force. The echoes of the screams began to multiply, and the feeling of panic took hold of everyone. A gasp escaped Javier's throat, and he collapsed to the ground. Lucia, terrified, tried to open the door, but her trembling hands could do nothing. A shadowy figure appeared in front of them, a tall, dark silhouette with empty eyes that reflected a darkness much deeper than the night itself. The evil that inhabited the house was there, manifesting itself in a tangible form, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Carlos, trembling with fear, cried out, "Run!" But the figure's voice was louder, a deep, unnatural whisper creeping into their minds. "There is no escape. This is what belongs to me." Terror began to dominate everything. With no way out, no hope, the group of friends watched as the figure advanced towards them, absorbing the light of their lanterns, devouring their heat. The darkness swallowed everything. The house, old and cursed, had made its final claim. And in that last moment, the screams were absorbed by the house as if they had never existed. The story of the house in the woods ended there, with darkness as the only witness. A group of hikers decided to venture into one of the most mysterious caverns in the country, a place known for its depth and dark secrets. The cave, located in a remote mountainous region, was famous among caving enthusiasts, but few dared to explore it completely due to the legends that revolved around it. It was said that those who entered beyond a certain point never returned, and although many took it as simple old wives' tales, the sense of unease was palpable. It was a gray day when the group, made up of 5 people, entered the cave. The expedition had begun with enthusiasm and laughter, sharing anecdotes and enjoying the thrill of the unknown. As they made their way through the narrow corridors, the air became denser and the temperature dropped, but still, no one seemed worried. Their lanterns cut through the darkness, creating long, twisted shadows on the rock walls. "Just a few more minutes, and we'll get to the deepest point," said Andrew, the group leader, with a confident smile. "It will be a challenge, but we will get through it without a hitch." But something began to change. At first, it was just a sensation, something subtle that others didn't seem to notice. A strange pressure in the air, as if the darkness itself were absorbing the light from their flashlights. As they advanced further and further, the cave seemed to transform. The corridors became narrower, the rocks sharper, and a piercing cold penetrated to the bone. "Why don't the flashlights shine well?" asked Laura, one of the youngest hikers in the group, staring at her flashlight in bewilderment. "No matter what I do, the light seems weaker." Andrew frowned, adjusting the light of his own flashlight, but he also noticed that the light was not as powerful as it should be. "It must be some kind of reflection or something with the walls," he said in a reassuring tone. "Humidity probably plays tricks." However, as they advanced, the darkness seemed to engulf them more and more. The walls of the cave were strangely smooth in places, as if the rock had been molded by an invisible hand. The sounds of their own footsteps became more and more muffled, as if the air was absorbing every noise they made. And in the silence, something began to disturb them even more. It wasn't just fear, but a deep, growing sense that something was watching them, stalking them from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" muttered Carlos, another member of the group. Everyone stopped and listened, but the silence was deep. There was no trace of life in the air, only an abyss of stillness. "I think it's the echo of our voices," Andrew said, trying to downplay the situation. We're in a cave, after all. But no one could shake the feeling that they were not alone. Suddenly, one of the corridors widened, offering a small cave inside. The group decided to go inside, thinking that maybe it was the perfect place to get some rest before continuing their exploration. However, as soon as they entered, the air seemed to become heavier, as if something was accumulating around them. Laura looked around nervously. There's something weird about this place. It's like vibrating. Carlos began to move through the space, touching the walls of the cave. Nothing weird here, just rocks, he said, but his voice sounded unconvinced. Suddenly he stopped and looked at the ceiling. What's that? Everyone looked up and a shiver ran down their spines at the sight of the strange marks on the walls. They looked like hand-carved symbols, although they were completely unknown. Some of them twisted and bent in almost unnatural ways, as if they were alive. It's like he's cursed, Laura said, her voice trembling. Andres frowned, trying to rationalize the situation. They're probably just marks made by ancient explorers. Come on, let's not panic. But panic was beginning to seep into their minds. The cave no longer felt like a simple abandoned place, but like something much darker, something that had been waiting for its arrival. The light from the flashlights flickered once more, and this time it wasn't because of the humidity. We have to get out of here, Carlos said, his voice strained. This doesn't feel right. We need to get back to the point of entry. Okay, Andrew replied, but we need to find our way back first. As they tried to find their way around, they began to realize that the hallways were not the same. The road by which they had come seemed to have vanished. Each time they advanced, the terrain seemed to change, twisting and bending in ways they couldn't comprehend. The cave seemed to be alive, changing according to its movement, as if it was trapping them in an endless maze. Why does everything look different now?" murmured Laura, her voice breaking. "This cannot be possible." Suddenly the sound of something ripping at the rock broke the air, followed by a low whisper gliding through the cave. It was a strange sound, almost as if someone was walking in the shadows, too close to be ignored. "We are being watched," cried Carlos, his face pale with terror. A figure suddenly appeared before them, emerging from the shadows with frightful slowness. It wasn't fully human, but it wasn't a completely unknown creature either. His body seemed to be composed of an amalgam of rocks and shadows, and his face was a distorted mask, devoid of clear features. There were no eyes, only a deep darkness that seemed to absorb the light from the lanterns. "What the hell is that?" Laura shouted, recoiling in terror. The figure slid closer, the air around him growing colder. The sense of panic increased, and their hearts were pounding, as if they could hear the creature's heartbeat echoing in their chests. "Run!" shouted Andrew as the creature slithered toward them. But the way out seemed to have vanished completely, as if the cave was holding them back, sealing off all possible escape routes. The creature came even closer, its form fading and reappearing as if it were between the worlds. In an instant, one of the flashlights went out, plunging them into an even deeper darkness. "We can't stay here. He's going to catch us," shouted Laura, taking Carlos's hand. "We have to." But the creature was above them, and the darkness enveloped them completely. Fear, terror, and panic took hold of them. There was no escape, and then everything went out. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9, and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door, and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but..." I don't know you. How do you know my name? The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it. Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. I don't know you. The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. You don't need to be nervous, she said with an eerie calm. I just want to talk. It's important. Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. What do you want? He asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. Come with me. There are things you need to remember. A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. I'm going to call the police if you don't leave, he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. You can do it if you prefer, he replied with unsettling calmness, but it won't change anything. Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. I shouldn't have, Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. What I want you to remember is that, he finally said. Remember what you forgot. Laura frowned, completely bewildered. I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you? The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. I am someone from your past, he replied, his voice deeper. Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you. Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her, a primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. Leave me alone, he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. You can't run away from who you are. The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. What do you want from me? He murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten. Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. When Javier walked into the antique store on a cold winter afternoon, he didn't know his life would never be the same. The air was thick, full of dust and the unmistakable smell of old wood. The store, located in a forgotten corner of the city, seemed like a refuge for everything that had been left behind, for those objects that time had marked, but that still had something of value inside. Every corner was crammed with strange artifacts, broken clocks, opaque mirrors, unusually shaped furniture, and portraits of expressionless faces that seemed to observe the visitor with an eerie calm. Javier had been attracted to the store by a strange sensation, something inexplicable that had pushed him to enter. The owner, an elderly man, sat behind a counter full of more items for sale, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't pay much attention to it at first, as his gaze was fixed on an object he couldn't stop staring at. A portrait. The painting was hung on one of the back walls. An ancient portrait of a man with a serious face, but with a penetrating gaze that seemed to follow him even from a distance. The man painted in the picture wore a white linen shirt and a dark hat, and his countenance, though calm, conveyed a sense of uneasiness that could not be ignored. The eyes, dark and deep, stood out with a peculiar intensity. Javier felt a chill run down his spine as he watched them. The shop owner looked at him over his glasses and, in a raspy voice, told him that the painting had belonged to a man with a dark history, a history that the townspeople preferred to forget. He said that no one in his right mind should buy it, but Javier, although bewildered by the old man's words, felt that something inside him was impelling him to take it. Maybe it was the feeling of being able to own something so unique, something with so much history. The old man, seeing that Javier was not going to change his mind, gave him the price, and finally the man took it. When he returned home, Javier hung the portrait on the wall of his living room, right in front of the sofa where he used to spend his nights watching television. At first everything seemed normal, although I couldn't help but feel a strange discomfort every time I looked at the painting. The eyes of the man in the portrait looked like move, but it couldn't be. I was sure I was imagining things. However, that feeling of discomfort grew with each passing day. One night, after a long day at work, Javier sat on his sofa, tired, and saw the portrait once more. This time the feeling was different. The eyes of the man in the painting not only followed him, but stalked him. No matter where he moved in the room, those eyes stared at him. A chill ran through his body as a cold sweat pooled on his forehead. He blinked several times, trying to get the idea out of his head. It couldn't be real. How could it? It was just a painting. But as the night wore on, the presence of those eyes made him feel more and more trapped. As the days went by, Javier began to see things that he could not explain. Sometimes, when he looked at the portrait, the man's eyes seemed to move slightly, as if they were fixed on him. Other times I felt something in the room change, as if the air was charged with a palpable tension. The shadows seemed to be longer than usual, and the noises in the house were intensifying. Creaking walls, barely audible whispers. He woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw was darkness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were stalking him even in his dreams. The situation worsened when, one night, Javier decided to move the portrait to another wall, in an attempt to free himself from the growing sense of anxiety. However, in doing this, something strange happened. As he lifted the painting, a feeling of extreme cold came over him and a dark shadow seemed to cover the place. The eyes of the man in the portrait were staring at him, more intense than ever. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the house. Javier felt an indescribable panic, as if the air itself was pressing on him, as if something invisible was imprisoning him. He couldn't take it anymore and left the portrait on the floor, determined to get rid of it the next day. But that night was the worst of all. Javier woke up with a stabbing pain in his chest, as if someone was pressing his heart. He sat up in bed, looking around, and it was then that he saw something he would never forget. The man in the portrait was standing on the threshold of his room door. His figure was dull, blurred, but his eyes were still the same, those eyes that had haunted him since day one. It was not a dream. It couldn't be. Javier tried to scream, but his voice did not come out. Terror paralyzed him. The man in the portrait began to walk towards him, and with each step, the ground creaked under his weight. Javier tried to move, to get up, but his body did not respond. He was trapped, completely at the mercy of that evil presence that was advancing towards him. The man's eyes shone with a terrifying intensity, as if they had taken on a life of their own, as if they were devouring his soul. At that moment, Javier understood that the portrait was not just a painting. It was a prison, and he was the victim. Suddenly, an invisible force lifted him from the ground and dragged him towards the portrait. He tried to fight, but his strength was fading. The man in the painting watched him unhurriedly while Javier fell to his knees in front of him. At that moment, the air became heavy, almost unbearable, and everything around him began to crumble. The ground beneath his feet disintegrated and the walls faded into darkness. Javier was being absorbed by the painting. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, He managed to turn and see the portrait before being completely consumed. The man in the portrait was looking at him with a satisfied expression, as if he had served his purpose. At that moment, Javier understood that he had been chosen. The portrait had not only stalked him, but had claimed him. The house fell silent. The portrait continued to hang on the wall as if nothing had changed. Nobody knew what had happened to Javier. No one knew that, in that painting, there was now a new look, a new pair of eyes that would follow anyone who dared to observe it, catching the next victim just as it had done with him. The cursed portrait was still waiting in silence, ready to claim whatever was necessary to satisfy his eternal hunger. Since time immemorial, the small town of San Sebastian had lived under the shadow of a mysterious bell that could be heard in the distance. The bell, an ancient piece of bronze that hung atop the village church, had a sound that echoed through the mountains. It was not just any bell, its toll was heard in moments of great anguish, marking the proximity of death. As the years passed, the villagers began to get used to it, but they also learned to fear it. When the bell rang, someone was going to die, and everyone knew it. The sound was deep, heavy, as if the wind itself shrank in his presence. Some said that it was the voice of a soul trapped between two worlds, while others claimed that the bell was cursed, condemned to ring every time the life of an inhabitant was extinguished. The elders of the village remembered that it had been installed generations ago by a priest who disappeared without a trace. No one had ever managed to decipher the true origin of the bell. Everyone was afraid to approach her. The people had survived generations of suffering, always with the same curse lurking. The deaths came with the sound of the bell, which never failed, never stopped. In the darkness of the night, its sound penetrated the houses of the inhabitants, announcing the fate of some of them. Some tried to ignore it, but everyone knew that if the bell rang, death was near. On a stormy night, the sound of the bell was louder than ever. He struck with an intensity that seemed to reverberate in the bowels of the people. Each blow was a terrifying echo, echoing off the walls of the houses, shaking the hearts of the bravest. No one in the village had ever heard such a loud and ominous ringing. Anguish took hold of all who heard that sound, which reached the depths of their souls. But that night, there was someone who did not give in to fear. Alejandro, a brave young man determined to discover the truth behind the bell, decided to investigate. He had heard many stories and legends about his origin, but the need for answers had led him to challenge superstitions. As the storm raged, Alejandro left his house with a flashlight in hand. I knew something wasn't right, but I was willing to face the unknown. The streets of the town were deserted, the windows closed and the doors barred. The houses, normally full of life, had become mausoleums, all the inhabitants fearful of the bell. Alejandro walked through the deserted alleys, the wind whipping his face, but he did not hesitate. The church, which stood like a dark giant on the top of the hill, was waiting for him. I knew that there I would find the answer. The bell could not be the only mystery in that place. Something else was hidden. Something else was waiting to be revealed. As he ascended the steep path that led to the church, the fog thickened, enveloping everything around him. The light of the lantern trembled with every step he took, as if darkness were trying to swallow everything in its path. The sound of the bell kept ringing louder and louder, closer and closer. It was as if the bell itself was calling him, guiding him to his destination. When he reached the doors of the church, Alejandro felt a chill run down his spine. The doors, which had always been closed, were now ajar, as if they were waiting for him. Without thinking, he pushed the door hard, and as he crossed the threshold, the cold air enveloped him. The church, normally a place of peace, was now plunged into dense darkness. There was no light except for Alexander's lantern, which struggled to light the way. The sound of the bell seemed to come from deep within the church. Alexander walked slowly toward the altar, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. As he advanced, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, as if shadows were watching his every move. The walls of the church rose like giants, and the roof seemed to crumble above his head. The figures carved into the stone, the statues of the saints, looked strange, deformed by the darkness. Finally, he reached the altar where the bell hung overhead just above a stone pedestal. It was huge, its size huge, and its presence overwhelming. There were no visible strings or mechanisms, and yet the bell kept ringing, non-stop. Alexander, paralyzed with terror, looked up at the altar and saw something that made him shudder. An old book, covered in dust and dark stains, rested on the pedestal. A pale glow emanated from its pages. With trembling hands, Alejandro brought the lantern closer to the book. When he opened it, a feeling of discomfort invaded him, as if the church itself breathed with him. The words of the book seemed to move, change, twist, as if the text were alive. And at that moment, a whispering voice echoed in his mind. "You have awakened what was asleep." The words floated in the air, and the sound of the bell increased in intensity, resounding in every corner of the church. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Alejandro felt a pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was crushing him. The book lit up with a sinister glow, and the shadows on the walls began to move, to lengthen, as if they were coming to life. In an instant, the altar was transformed. What was once a sacred space became a prison. A gigantic shadow emerged from the darkness, a spectral figure, his face diffuse but full of evil. His eyes flashed with a red light, as if he was looking through Alexander's soul. The figure approached slowly, floating in the air, and with each step it took, the bell rang louder as if its tolling marked the end of time. Alejandro tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. I was trapped, caught in the curse of the bell, caught in a cycle that would never end. The figure caught up with him, and an overwhelming cold came over him. The being spoke in a guttural whisper, words that Alejandro did not understand, but which resounded in his mind like a terrifying echo. "The town is scarred," said the shadow, his voice penetrating every corner of the church. "And you, Alejandro, have sealed your fate. They will all fall under the weight of the bell." A man named Marcos was in a small antique market on the outskirts of town, looking for something unique to decorate his house. He had visited several stores, but none of them seemed to offer what he was looking for. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky a faint orange, as soft light illuminated the old, dusty objects that lined the shelves. There was something special about that market, something that attracted the curious and lovers of the old. However, she did not know that that afternoon would change her life forever. In the far corner of the antique store, something caught his eye. It was a mirror covered with a black velvet cloth. Its frame, carved from dark wood, seemed centuries old. But what really captivated Mark was the strange energy emanating from it. Without thinking much, he approached and, with a fearful gesture, lifted the cloth that covered him. The first thing he noticed was the reflection. The mirror did not show the antique shop as one would expect. Instead, it reflected a dark corridor covered in shadows. It was as if, somehow, the mirror was a portal to another place, a place that had nothing to do with the reality I knew. The salesman, a strange-looking and aged man, observed Marcos's reaction. "That mirror, it has a history. He's not like the others," she said in a raspy voice. "It is said that it shows what we do not want to see, what we fear." Mark, intrigued by the mysterious warning, asked more, but the man simply waved his hand. "What you see cannot be erased. If you decide to take it, don't go back to me for answers." Without thinking about it any longer, Marcos paid the price and took the mirror, ignorant of what awaited him. From the moment she placed him in her house, a sense of unease began to wash over her. It was as if something was constantly watching him. I couldn't stop looking at the mirror, but as I did, I began to feel a presence. At first, it was just a whisper in his mind, a passing sensation that he quickly dismissed as suggested by the salesman's story. But as night fell, things began to change. As the daylight faded and darkness invaded his home, he began to notice something strange in the reflection of the mirror. A movement, something that slipped through the shadows of that corridor that appeared in the glass. It wasn't something clear or defined, but something was definitely moving, something that shouldn't be there. Mark, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, approached the mirror, observing more closely. It was then that he saw her for the first time. A female figure, her face obscured by long dark hair, appeared in the reflection. His body was on its back, but his movements were unsettling, as if he was slowly walking towards him, unhurriedly. Fear took hold of him, but the worst was yet to come. Each night, as I looked in the mirror, the figure began to get closer and closer, until the time came when I could clearly see his face. A pale face without eyes, with an empty expression, a macabre grimace that seemed to follow him, to observe him without rest. When Mark turned to look around his house, he found nothing out of the ordinary. But when she turned her gaze to the mirror, the woman was closer than she had ever imagined. As the days went by, the presence of the figure began to become more tangible, more oppressive. During the night hours, Marcos could not sleep. He always felt that something was watching him, something that was stalking him in the dark. In his house, a feeling of lingering cold began to spread to every corner. The air seemed to become dense, as if an invisible pressure enveloped him, making it difficult for him to breathe, as if each inhalation was a painful exertion. He tried to ignore the images he saw in the mirror, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop looking, as if an invisible force was forcing him to do so. Each time he looked away, the woman's figure seemed closer, more alive, more real. I felt her empty gaze fixed on him, feeling the weight of his presence in every corner of the room. The figure was not only watching him from the mirror, but began to manifest outside of it. Marcos saw strange shadows in the reflection, figures fading and appearing, as if the house itself were being invaded by that dark corridor. Sometimes I heard footsteps, faint whispers that could not be explained. His mind was filled with dark thoughts, as if something was inside him, controlling his thoughts and his body. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he tried to get rid of the mirror. He covered it with a blanket, kept it in the basement, but the woman's feeling never went away. In his dreams, she was chasing him, her empty eyes fixed on him, getting closer and closer until darkness enveloped him completely. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed into the real world from the reflection. That's when the figure began to speak, a soft, almost whispering voice that didn't come from any physical place, but that he could hear clearly in his mind. "I've been watching you, Marcos. I followed you from the moment you first looked at me. You're mine now, and you always will be." The words completely froze him. Each night the visits became more frequent, and the woman's presence began to take on a more solid shape. Terror consumed him, but there was no escape. In the mirrors of each room, the woman appeared, always closer, always more threatening. He began to lose track of time. He spent his nights staring at the reflection, caught by its empty gaze, as if something inside him was holding him captive. The shadows grew longer in every corner of the house, and fear enveloped him more with each passing hour. One afternoon, while he was in front of the mirror, Marcos saw something he never imagined. The woman's figure began to come out of the reflection. First, his fingers touching the glass, then a full hand, until the figure completely slid into the real world. His skin was cold, his body thin and twisted, as if he were a shadow in human form. His face was completely empty, with no eyes, but his lips curled into a malevolent smile. Marcos tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. He couldn't move, he couldn't escape. The woman approached him, her cold and long fingers touching his face, caressing his skin as if it were a macabre caress. He could feel the chill of her presence enveloping him, an indescribable sense of terror paralyzing him, as if he were trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The figure spoke again, his voice now louder, deeper. "Now you are mine forever. You'll never escape me. You are condemned to live in my reflection." Marcos tried to move away, but his body was no longer responding. Darkness surrounded him, and the figure dragged him into the mirror. Their screams were silenced, and the house fell into a deadly silence. From that moment on, no one saw Marcos again. The house was empty, his mirror there in the same place where he had left it. The reflection, as always, showed that dark corridor, with a female figure walking slowly, getting closer and closer, a presence that stalked those who dared to look. The eyeless woman continued her journey like a shadow that never goes out, always waiting for the next victim who dared to buy the mirror. The antiques market still exists, but no one remembers the man who disappeared in the reflection, nor the warning he left behind. The mirror is still waiting, hidden in a corner, with the figure of the lady watching those who approach, waiting for the right moment to come out again. Years ago, archaeologist Enrique Martinez had dedicated his life to the study of ancient cultures. Since he was a child, he had been attracted by history and vanished civilizations. He had traveled continents, unearthed secrets, and unraveled enigmas. But what awaited him that afternoon at an excavation in a remote South American village would surpass anything he had seen before. An old legend circulating in the local community told of a reliquary, an object of ancient power that possessed the ability to unleash the worst of horrors. In the village, they called it the Reliquary of Death. No one dared to approach the excavation area for fear that the dark forces would awaken. However, Henry, with his insatiable desire for knowledge and his skepticism about such stories, ignored the warnings and decided to delve deeper into the search. One day, after weeks of meticulous work, Enrique and his team discovered something they didn't expect. Among the rubble of a structure that dated back centuries, something metallic glowed faintly in the sunlight. At first, he thought it was just a piece of pottery, but as he cleaned it with great care, he soon realized that it was a locket, small but adorned with intricate engravings and strange symbols that seemed to move as he looked at them. With trembling hands and a mixture of excitement and caution, Henry grasped the locket. The piece seemed to have a life of its own. The aged gold shone in a way that hypnotized him. However, a shiver ran down his spine when, as he opened the locket, he felt a dark energy that was unleashed with a rumble that echoed in his chest. Suddenly, an icy air invaded the place, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, as if they wanted to devour him. Enrique took a step back, looking for the locket with his eyes, but it was too late. The evil had been released. Darkness took over his mind, and something inside him whispered, though he couldn't understand it. A heavy silence descended upon the camp. The men around him began to feel him, as if an unknown presence was stalking them, watching them from the shadows. That night, the first strange events began. The air grew heavier, the stars shone brightly, but they offered no comfort, only a warning. Enrique was alone in his tent when, suddenly, a feeling of extreme cold enveloped him. At first he thought it might be the wind, but he soon realized that it was not natural. The light of his flashlight flickered, then went out, and in the darkness he could hear a low, deep whisper, like the murmur of voices rising from the bowels of the earth itself. His hands trembled as he reached for his lighter, but as he did so, something stopped him. A pair of red eyes flashed in the darkness, watching him, looking at him with terrifying intensity. Enrique felt his heart racing, terror running through his skin. He tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat, as if an invisible force was oppressing him. His eyes drew closer and closer until Enrique felt that he was about to be dragged into that darkness. The vision suddenly faded. The store returned to calm, but Enrique knew that it had not been a dream. Something had changed inside him. The locket had not only released an evil force, but it had also left a mark on his soul. The next day, he tried to continue his work, but the atmosphere grew denser each time he approached the locket. The men in the camp began to abandon the excavations, terrified by the manifestations of the paranormal that happened every night. The voices whispered louder, and the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. Many of the workers said they saw shadowy figures slipping into the corners of their eyes. Some even began to fall ill inexplicably. A couple of days later, Enrique began to experience horrible nightmares. In his dreams, he saw a figure wrapped in a dark cloak, with red eyes and a sinister smile. The figure called him, invited him to join her, to follow the path to death. Every time I woke up, I felt like I wasn't alone. An invisible presence watched him, always close. One night, in an attempt to stop what he had unleashed, Enrique returned to the place where he had found the locket. He was determined to seal it again, to return it to the place where it belonged. But when he arrived, he realized that he could not do it. The shadows around him grew thicker and the air became thick as lead. Each step he took toward the locket, the stronger the pressure felt. It was as if the earth itself was alive, rejecting him. Finally, when he reached for the locket, something changed. The ground began to shake and a deafening sound filled his ears. It was the creaking of the bowels of the earth. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of him, shrouded in absolute darkness. He had no face, just an endless shadow. His voice echoed in Enrique's mind. "Do you think you can stop the inevitable? Do you think you can escape the fate that belongs to you?" Enrique tried to take a step back, but his body was unresponsive. The figure surrounded him, and darkness took over his being. The screams of his fellow diggers, who had returned in search of answers, coalesced into the air, echoing in his mind like a distant echo. Then, everything vanished. When Enrique woke up, he was in a dark place, surrounded by shadows. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, but it didn't matter. The reliquary had already fulfilled its purpose. He had unleashed the evil he had sought so much. The terror was complete. The story of Enrique Martinez disappeared from the face of the earth. No one knows what happened to him or his team. The records of the excavation were destroyed and the reliquary never reappeared. Some say that echoes of their cry can be heard when the moon is full, echoing through the air as a warning to those seeking ancient objects with desires for power. The reliquary of death is still waiting in some hidden place, for whoever dares to unleash terror once again. After years immersed in the emptiness of loneliness, a man finds himself trapped in a cycle of anguish and silence that seems eternal. The house, an old and gloomy building, has been his only refuge, but it soon becomes his worst prison. The walls that had given him shelter become a constant threat, full of murmurs and whispers that grow with each passing day. As the nights lengthen and darkness takes over every corner of the house, the feeling of being watched intensifies. What starts as simple noises from the old house, the creaking of the woods, the hum of the pipes, turns into something much more disturbing. Man, who has lived for years apart from the world, begins to hear a voice. It's low and whispering, almost inaudible, but enough to chill the blood of anyone in its place. At first, he convinces himself that he is imagining things. Loneliness is driving him crazy. After all, I've never experienced anything like it before, but the voice doesn't stop. It doesn't matter how hard you try to ignore it, how loud the music is, or how tight you keep the windows. The whispers come in clearer and clearer, until finally they are heard as if they were a palpable presence, nestled within the very walls of the house. Those whispers don't seem to have an end. They seem to come from the cracks, from the inside of the rotting wood, from the very earth on which the house was built. Every word she hears seems like a heavy burden settling on her mind, bringing with it painful memories she had buried years ago, memories she refuses to remember, but which the voice seems to uncover around her. As the days go by, the house becomes more claustrophobic. The walls, which once offered her a refuge, now feel like a trap. The voice, now clearer and full of despair, constantly stalks him. He speaks of dark secrets that he himself had forgotten, of events that he had deeply repressed. He remembers his mother's blank look when she left him at the door of his grandparents' house, the days they spent not knowing if he would ever see her again, the voices whispering about family betrayals and secrets that should never have come to light. The tension grows and the man begins to feel harassed not only by the voices, but also by the atmosphere that surrounds him. The shadows seem to move on their own and the lights in the house flicker for no apparent reason. The air becomes dense, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with it, waiting for something. The anxiety grows as the voices become clearer, more urgent, as if each word is a dagger piercing his soul. On one of the darkest nights, when the clock strikes the time when everything seems to be at its lowest, the voices finally reveal the source of their suffering. They are not simple echoes of the past. They are not simple forgotten memories. They are the voices of those he has wronged, people he has abandoned, betrayed, and left behind in his lonely life. They are the echoes of a conscience that does not let him rest, the whispers of a life that he himself destroyed without being aware of what he was doing. It is at that moment, when despair consumes him completely, that the walls begin to move. The first thing he notices is the deep, deafening creak, as if the very structure of the house is yielding under the weight of the secrets it holds. The walls, once solid and cold, are now deformed, as if the house is responding to the voices that filter through the cracks. The figure that materializes before him is blurred, incomplete, like a shadow that still struggles to take shape. But he is not a figure who inspires peace. His eyes, empty and dark, seem to look directly into his soul, stripping him naked. The creature, an amalgam of shadows and repressed memories, slowly approaches, its footsteps barely audible but unmistakable. The man wants to scream, but his lips do not respond. He wants to run away, but his legs won't move. He is trapped, surrounded by the presence of those he has failed. The creature speaks, and its voice is a mixture of the whispers and cries of the past. It is a voice that takes his breath away, that fills him with a terror so deep that he feels that he is going to faint at any moment. He speaks to him of guilt, of the crimes he has committed in the name of indifference and loneliness. It reminds him of his lies, his broken promises, and the empty life he has chosen to live. Every word is a weight on your chest, every breath an effort to stay conscious. The darkness in the house seems to be denser now, as if the house itself is devouring the light, dragging the man into the deepest darkness. Memories of his mother, of his abandonment, of his lost childhood, strike him with such brutal force that he feels like he's falling apart. But he can't move. He can't escape. The creature shows him the scene he had never wanted to remember. He, as a child, looking out the window as his mother walks away with a sad smile on her face. There are no words between them, only a void that stretches between them, an abyss of silence that he could never fill. The figure stops right in front of him, and in an almost imperceptible whisper says, "It's your fault, this is all your fault." It is at that moment, when despair completely consumes him, that the man finally falls to the ground, his hands trembling as they cling to the weathered wood. Panic engulfs him, terror consumes him, and the truth finally hits him with full force. He can't escape his past. He can't escape the people he's left behind, the lives he's destroyed. The house, which was once his refuge, is now his grave. Man finds himself alone, surrounded by the shadows of the past, the echoes of those he has failed. The creature vanished, but its presence remains dormant, like a mark that follows it through the darkness. The walls, which were once the barriers of his solitary life, are now the bars of his condemnation. Finally, the house begins to creak, the sound ringing in her ears as the walls crumble around her. Darkness envelops him completely, and silence consumes him. Man will never be alone again, but the company he has now is that of his own demons, and there is no escape. The voice, the creature, the house, everything merges into an endless nightmare. Panic consumes him completely, and in the ultimate darkness, man finally understands what he has lost. And that's when the final whisper rings in his ears, a lament that will follow him for all eternity. It had been a long journey on lonely roads, in a place forgotten by time and the passage of men. The traveler, tired and exhausted, had not seen any sign of life for miles. The road was like an endless river of asphalt, flanked by trees that stretched out to the horizon, as if they wanted to devour it. The sunlight was beginning to fade, dyeing the sky a warm, ominous red. He thought about stopping at any hostel, but in his desperation he barely saw a small sign indicating the existence of a hotel. "Forgotten Hotel," read the faded paint on the sign. It seemed perfect for an overnight stay, a refuge, a break from the endless road. When he arrived, the place seemed much older than he had expected. The walls of the hotel, covered in moss and mold, gave the impression that the place had been forgotten by the whole world. The building was large, two-story, with broken windows and doors that creaked as they moved. However, something about the place attracted him, and fatigue pushed him to enter. The door opened with a frightful creak, but on the other side there was nothing but darkness. He hesitated for a moment, but then the need for rest overcame logic. He pushed open the door, which slowly gave way, revealing the hall. The front desk was dark, with only a dim light flickering over the counter. A strange-looking man with an aged face and an expressionless gaze was sitting behind the counter. He didn't say anything, just looked up and gave him a room key. The traveler accepted it with an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. The atmosphere was strange, as if time did not exist within the walls of the hotel. He climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of the stairs creak beneath his feet. When he reached the hallway, he realized that the walls were covered with old photographs, but not the typical family photographs. No, they showed strange and distorted faces, people with empty eyes and disconcerting expressions. Somehow, those images seemed familiar, as if they were staring at him. However, he kept going, ignoring a sensation that he couldn't shake. The room was small, with an aged-looking wooden bed and a window that looked out onto a desolate landscape, as if the world were just an endless expanse of gray land. The lamp flickered, and when he turned off the light, the room was plunged into deep darkness. But something wasn't right. There was a smell of humidity and something else in the air. Something he couldn't identify, something that made him uncomfortable. He went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. Shadows seemed to move around the room, slipping through cracks in the walls and ceiling. He got up, and as he approached the window, he looked more closely at the outside. There was no movement in the landscape, but something in the distance caught his attention. A figure standing in the middle of the field, motionless, looking towards the hotel. The figure looked human, but its posture was strange, as if it was unnatural. The traveler looked away, feeling a twinge in his chest, but when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. Restlessness began to take hold of him, and he decided to leave the room. He returned to the corridor, where the old portrait seemed to look at him with more intensity. Upon arriving at the lobby, he noticed that the man at the front desk was no longer there. Instead, a door was ajar, and on the other side, a light flickered faintly. Intrigued, he walked over and pushed her cautiously. What he saw took his breath away. In the room was a wooden table covered with dust, and on it an old photo album. He approached and opened it. The photos were from previous hotel guests, but something was wrong. The people in the photos did not have full faces. Their eyes were hollow, empty, and their smiles distorted. On the last page, one photo in particular made his blood run cold. It was him. He was in the picture, even though he had never been there before. The image showed his face with empty eyes and a macabre smile that froze his soul. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to creak, and a deafening sound, like a murmur of whispering voices, filled the air. The walls began to shake, and the traveler felt as if the shadows in the corridor surrounded him. In horror, he noticed that the figures in the photos seemed to come to life, their empty eyes fixed on him as their lips formed mute words. Suddenly, one of the figures detached from the photo and dissolved into a dark fog that began to envelop him. Fear invaded him completely. He ran to the door, but before he could reach it, the figure in the photograph appeared before him, now a grim specter, with a sinister smile that seemed to mock his despair. The figure stretched out its hand towards him, and the traveler, unable to move, felt as if the air were escaping from his lungs. Every corner of the hotel was filled with voices whispering dark secrets about everyone who had been there before him. The hotel's former guests, those who had disappeared without a trace, were now part of an eternal curse. The traveler, in his attempt to escape, ran to the exit, but in the hall he saw the walls crumble, photographs falling from the walls, and figures in the photos sliding toward him closer and closer. He tried to open the door, but it was sealed, trapped inside the hotel. In a last-ditch attempt to find a way out, he stepped into the darkness of the hallway, but the sound of whispering voices surrounded him completely. All he could hear was a distant echo, one last warning: no one leaves this hotel. The hotel, that crumbling construction that seemed to be on the edge of nowhere, swallowed the traveler, and his soul was trapped next to the former guests, condemned to repeat their agony over and over again. The shadows of the hotel continued to lurk, awaiting the arrival of another lone traveler who would fall into its trap, unable to escape the horrors that lurked within its walls. There was something about the old university that had always troubled Javier. It was a place steeped in history, where the corridors stretched as if they had no end, and the walls whispered forgotten secrets. He had studied there for years, but he had always felt that something strange was hiding behind its ancient walls. Something that could not be seen, but could be perceived. His curiosity as a student of history had led him to investigate every corner of that building. However, what he would discover that afternoon would change his life forever. Javier had been trapped in the library until late, as he often did when he couldn't stop studying. He was reviewing some old documents on the history of the university when, among the dusty pages of an old book, something fell to the floor. He bent down to pick it up and found a small key, made of a strange, opaque, almost black metal. It was heavy in his hands, and the feeling it conveyed was not of something ordinary. A strange feeling of uneasiness took hold of his body, a pressure in his chest that he could not explain. Despite the strange vibration emitted by the key, his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to keep it in his backpack, not knowing what connection it would have with what he was about to experience. That night, as he was returning to his room, Javier passed near a corridor that had always seemed desolate and gloomy to him. It was located in an old wing of the university that was rarely visited by students. The hallway was dimly lit by warm light lamps that created eerie shadows on the stone walls. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, but something stopped him. He looked at a door at the end of the hall, a door he had never noticed before. She was almost hidden by a heavy curtain that fell to the floor, and the key in her hand seemed to whisper to her. He felt he had to get closer. The air was thick and cold as Javier approached the door. He didn't know why, but he felt like his heart was beating faster. With a trembling hand, he took the key out of his backpack and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a dull creak as if it had been closed for centuries. The room beyond was plunged into darkness, but a strange energy emanated from it. Javier took a step inside, and instantly the atmosphere seemed to become heavier, as if the atmosphere was impregnated with something old and forgotten. A strange echo echoed in his ears, as if someone or something was watching him from the darkness. The feeling of being watched grew, and Javier felt that something was not right. His breathing quickened. Then, in the midst of the gloom, something moved. Soft steps, almost imperceptible, but close enough to make his skin stand on end. Javier turned, looking for the source of that noise, but he saw nothing. The door closed behind him with a thud that made him jump with a start. Instantly, a shudder ran through his body. What he saw next was a vision he could never erase from his mind. An endless corridor stretched out before him, so dark that it seemed to devour the light. However, there was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. The shadows moved, stretched, and shrank around them as if they had a life of their own. The air became even denser and the silence became unbearable. Then, from the depths of darkness, a voice whispered his name. It wasn't a human voice, nor was it a familiar whisper. It was an unnatural, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Javier. The voice not only called him by name, but spoke to his soul, filling it with indescribable terror. The shadows began to move more quickly as if attracted by his presence. Javier felt that something was stalking him, that he was not alone, and at that moment a shiver ran down his spine. A sound, similar to a heavy sigh, slid through the walls, getting closer with every breath I took. At first, Javier thought it was his imagination, a simple illusion created by the darkness of the corridor. But then, a dark shadow, denser than the void itself, materialized before him. It was the form of a human being, but its eyes shone with an unearthly empty light, as if there was no life inside. The figure did not walk. It floated, gliding on the ground with a spectral grace. Javier tried to back away, but his feet seemed to be glued to the ground, as if the corridor itself was holding him back. The figure began to slowly approach, and Javier could hear the cracking of his own bones as he tried to move. The shadow stared at him, its empty eyes fixed on his. An icy cold enveloped his body, making him shiver violently. The figure whispered something that Javier could not understand, but the sensation it produced was clear. Death was stalking him. Desperate, Javier tried to run, but his legs did not respond. Shadows rose around him, enveloping him. A mocking, sinister, and resounding laugh filled the air, as if the very walls were laughing at their suffering. A dark, oppressive energy crushed him, pushed him forward into the unknown. There was no escape. The darkness devoured him. When he finally managed to take a step, the feeling of being watched grew even more. He realized that he was not alone in that hallway, that other presences surrounded him. Formless beings, wandering shadows that seemed to feed on his fear. He could feel their piercing gazes as if their eyes were piercing him, and for a moment, Javier felt his very soul fade under the weight of those empty eyes. As he moved forward, the corridor seemed to get longer and longer. The murmurs of the shadows intensified, and a strange heat began to invade the atmosphere. But it was not the warmth of a friendly presence. It was the heat of something evil, as if hell itself was taking shape around him. A shiver ran down his spine when, in the darkness, he heard a clearer voice, this time human. A man's voice, raspy, broken by time. "Why have you come here?" Javier turned quickly, looking for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just shadows, twisted and dark. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in his head. An unbearable weight accumulated in his chest. The pressure was getting more and more intense. The dark figure drew nearer and nearer, and the cold of death caressed his face. The voice resounded again. "This place is not for you. What you find here can never be undone." Javier wanted to scream, but his lips wouldn't move. He tried to turn back, but the corridor closed around him as if the darkness itself had caught him. Shadows began to advance towards him, taking shape, becoming human figures, their eyes empty and their mouths open in a grotesque grimace. "Run!" shouted an inner voice, but Javier could no longer move. The last shadow, the largest and darkest, slipped toward him and stretched out a spectral hand toward his face. The feeling of cold intensified, until all Javier could feel was nothingness. And then the corridor fell into absolute silence. The door, the one he had opened, closed again. The key disappeared, leaving behind a forgotten corridor, awaiting the arrival of the next victim. Ever since he moved into the old apartment building, Javier had felt a strange presence. It wasn't something tangible, but a nagging sense of being watched. The building, with its narrow corridors and mold on the walls, seemed to have a life of its own. However, what worried him most was not the age of the place, or even the strange noises during the night. What really disturbed him was the absolute silence during the day, as if the building was waiting for something or someone. When Javier signed the contract, he was excited. He had been looking for a place where he could live alone, a refuge where he could focus on his work and be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The price was incredibly low, almost too good to be true, but the realtor, an older man with a serious look, assured him that there would be no problem. However, he did not tell her everything. The first night was quiet until something strange happened. Javier woke up in the middle of the night, startled by a feeling of discomfort. I felt like something wasn't right, but I couldn't identify what it was. The air in his apartment was heavy, dense, as if someone was standing in the same room watching him. At first he thought it was darkness playing tricks with his mind, but when he looked down the hall, he could swear that he saw a slowly moving shadow. It wasn't the first time she'd moved. I had been to several places before, and I had never experienced anything like it. Even though I was used to moving and living in new places, something about this apartment seemed different. The air was charged with an energy that kept him alert, a heavy energy, as if something was trapped in that place and couldn't escape. At first, Javier tried to ignore him. He thought it was his mind, perhaps too tired from the stress of moving and adjusting to his new routine. But as the days passed, the feelings of discomfort only got worse. Every time he found himself in the hallway, he felt something following him. But when he looked back, there was nothing. It took several weeks before he decided to investigate the apartment's past. The realtor hadn't told her much about the previous tenants, only that the unit had been empty for several months. Javier felt that he needed to know more, as if that knowledge could help him understand why he felt that he was not alone. It was then that he met the neighbor of the apartment next door, a middle-aged woman named Mariana. She was sitting in the doorway, apparently waiting for someone to come by. Javier, with his natural curiosity, approached and struck up a conversation. "Do you know anything about apartment 304? He asked, pointing to her door. Mariana stared at him for a few seconds before answering. Something in his eyes didn't seem to want to talk about it, but finally, he sighed. "That place, he's not like the others," he said quietly. "The last tenant disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him, but the building was never the same after that." Javier frowned, confused. "Did it disappear? How? What do you mean he was never the same?" Mariana looked at him again, this time more cautiously. "That person never came back. It wasn't a simple abandonment, you understand? It was as if it had vanished. And after that, strange things started to happen. People have stopped living there. They have had experiences. Nobody wants to talk about it, but maybe you should leave before something happens to you." Javier felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know if what Mariana was saying to him was a joke, a superstition, or something more serious. However, he couldn't ignore the lingering feeling he had since moving in. It was as if the apartment was imbued with a dark energy that constantly surrounded him. That night, as he was getting ready for sleep, he heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. It was almost inaudible, but enough to startle him. I didn't understand where it came from, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Mariana had said. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if something was waiting outside his door, waiting to enter. Determined to find out the truth, Javier began to investigate more about the apartment. In the building manager's office, he gained access to the old records. There he found an entrance that mentioned the last tenant of 304, a man named Ivan Paredes. According to records, Ivan had been an ordinary man with no criminal record, someone who had lived in the building for nearly 2 years before disappearing without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle in his apartment. There was nothing to indicate that something had gone wrong, except for the nagging feeling that something had vanished. No one in the building seemed to know more, but Javier could sense that there was something dark hiding, something he couldn't fully comprehend. As the days passed, the presence in the apartment became more intense. Every night, Javier woke up with the feeling that someone was in his room, standing next to his bed, watching him in silence. At times, he felt cold breathing on his face, and when he turned around, he found no one. The shadows seemed to move along the walls, twisting and changing shape as if they were taking on a life of their own. The straw that broke the camel's back was when, one night, Javier woke up to find his mirror fogged up, but with something written on it. The letters seemed to form slowly, as if something invisible was writing the words in the cold mist of the glass. "I'm looking at you," he said. Fear took hold of him, and he knew he could no longer ignore it. It was as if Ivan, the former tenant, had never left the place. Something in his spirit had been trapped, doomed to wander around the apartment looking for a way to communicate. Javier tried to seek help, but all efforts were in vain. No one in the building seemed willing to talk openly about what was going on there. Mariana refused to say more, and the other neighbors simply walked away as if afraid to face the truth. Javier tried to do everything he could to flee from the presence, but he was trapped. One day, when he entered his apartment, the door slammed shut behind him and the light went out. It was completely dark, unable to move or find a way out. He felt a pressure in his chest, as if someone was choking him, and then he heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering in his ear, "I'm waiting for you." The door slammed open and Javier ran out of the apartment, trembling with terror. He knew that something in the apartment would not let him go. It had been an illusion to think that he could escape the curse that had taken over the place. Fear would haunt him forever. The spirit of the last tenant, Ivan, would never leave him. Somehow Javier had now become part of the cycle, and the apartment would follow him, trap him in its web. It didn't matter how far it went. The darkness would always find its way to him, and there would be no escape. The last tenant was not just a story of a lost spirit, but of a far more powerful force, something that transcended death and life itself, something that could never be forgotten. The dense air inside the cave felt even heavier with the rustling of rocks falling around it. The hikers had barely had time to react before the ground crumbled beneath their feet, falling into a dark, cold darkness. When at last the noise of the rocks died down, they found themselves in a vast subterranean space with the walls of the cave extending upwards like gigantic pillars, and the ceiling seemingly so high that the human eye could not see the end. However, the most frightening thing of all was the silence. A silence so dense and crushing that it seemed to devour every sound, every whisper, every breath. They had come with the intention of exploring, but now they were trapped, with no way of knowing if there was a way out, or if they would ever see the light of day again. Their lanterns flickered faintly in the darkness, as if the shadows themselves wanted to take hold of them. Dust-covered bodies with some superficial wounds from falls were trying to gather around a small illuminated area. Mark, the leader of the group, was the first to react, looking up at the cave walls for any sign of a way out. His breathing was rapid, his mind trying to process what had happened. Was there a way to escape? There didn't seem to be a clear path, just the cold, rocky walls that surrounded them. Emma, his longtime companion, came up to him, her face pale and full of fear. She didn't say anything, just held onto his arm tightly. "We have to look for a way out. This can't be the only thing," Mark said, his voice trembling but determined. The group, which had arrived as a simple excursion, was now caught up in something much more terrifying. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an even deeper abyss, an abyss in which not only physical darkness enveloped them, but also the anguish and despair that began to take hold of them. In the midst of the chaos and bewilderment, suddenly, something changed. Faint whispers, barely audible, began to fill the air. The group members stopped, their hearts pounding. The whispers were empty, as if coming from the very walls of the cave. There was no clear source, but everyone could feel them, like a presence moving, waiting. Fear began to grow within them, like a tangible presence surrounding them. "You heard that, didn't you?" asked Liam, one of the younger hikers, looking around with eyes full of dread. No one answered. Everyone was listening, but the silence remained like a veil over them, increasing the feeling that someone was watching them. "We must keep walking," Mark said finally, his voice breaking but firm. "Maybe we can find a way out if we keep moving forward." He tried to restore the calm that everyone was beginning to lose, but deep down, he knew that anxiety was consuming him as much as everyone else. With slow steps, the group moved forward, their flashlights illuminating the contours of the walls. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the vastness of the cave, as if the echo of each movement multiplied, amplified by the darkness. The air grew denser with each passing second, and the feeling of being watched only intensified. They spent what seemed like hours walking in circles, but no matter how far they went, they couldn't find a way out. Each turn led them to a new fork in the underground labyrinth, but none seemed to lead to anything more than a new darkness, deeper and more unnerving than the last. The fear was accumulating like a constant pressure on her breasts. The flashlights began to flicker, as if the batteries were running low, but everyone knew that was impossible. They had checked the flashlights before entering. Something was interfering with the energy that fed them, and then they saw it. At the end of a corridor, just at the edge of the lantern light, A figure appeared, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. Although they couldn't see him clearly, something in his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't human, not completely. His movements were slow but calculated, as if he were in no hurry. His figure seemed to merge with the darkness, and despite being several meters away from them, everyone felt a chill run down their spine. It was as if his very presence was filtering the air, invading the space with a fear so palpable that it was difficult to breathe. "What's that?" asked Emma, her voice almost a whisper, afraid that the walls themselves might hear her. The figure did not respond, but his presence was enough to make each member of the group paralyzed. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the sound of his heavy breaths filled the air. Something inside them was telling them that if they got any closer, if they tried to move a single muscle, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, the figure moved towards them, slowly moving forward, its face never fully visible. Each step seemed to increase the weight of the fear that enveloped them. The tension in the air became unbearable, as if everything was about to break. Mark, fighting the terror that paralyzed him, took a step back, trying to get away from the figure, but something stopped him. An invisible force seemed to press on his chest, preventing him from moving. "We can't stay here," shouted Liam, but his voice was filled with panic and despair. He tried to run, but his legs didn't respond, as if the ground itself had become unforgiving, unable to support his weight. The figure was getting closer, and now Mark could see something that made his blood run cold. Instead of a human face, what he saw was a void, an abyss in the place of the eyes, where there was only darkness. The figure began to speak, but his words were incomprehensible, swept away by a distant echo that seemed to come from everywhere. "This is the end," the figure whispered, his voice echoing in their minds. "There is no escape from the abyss. This is where it all ends." Terror seized them in an instant. There was no way out, there was no hope. The abyss had claimed those who had tried to escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shake violently, and the echo of a distant scream, filled with despair and pain, echoed through the walls of the cave. The figure began to fade into the darkness, but his laughter, filled with mockery and emptiness, continued to reverberate in the ears of the hikers. The last memories they had before succumbing to the abyss were the laughter and muffled screams, and the sound of rocks falling on them, as if the cave itself was closing its doors forever. The guardian of the abyss had served his purpose, and with his last laugh, the group of hikers disappeared, forever trapped in the endless darkness. The house stood lonely, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper to each other with each gust of wind. Its facade, aged by the passage of time, crumbled to one side, but its structure remained imposing, like a shadow that hid forgotten stories. For Laura and her family, this place represented a new opportunity, a fresh start after years of hardship. They moved without much thought, attracted by the apparent tranquility of the countryside and the promise of a home that could offer them peace. It was a rainy Monday when they arrived, the water pounding against the windows furiously, but nothing seemed to break the solemn atmosphere around them. The mother, Laura, watched nervously as her children, Alan and Sophia, ran around the house exploring every corner while she organized the first boxes. The air smelled of old wood, but despite the humidity that permeated everything, the house seemed to have a presence of its own, something that could never be ignored. The first hours passed without any notable incident. The children laughed, and Laura tried to organize the kitchen, which was larger than she had imagined. But soon they began to notice something strange. The echoes. At first they thought it was part of the place, that the old walls amplified the sounds. But the truth was much more terrifying. It all started when Laura called her children for dinner. "Alan, Sophia, dinner is ready," he shouted from the hallway. But what he answered was not the voice of his son or daughter, but a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Laura," the voice whispered, but it wasn't she who was listening to it. It was an alien voice, deep, ancient, that slipped through the house like a shadow. Laura thought it was a joke, but her children's eyes widened when they heard the answer. "Did you hear that?" asked Alan blankly. Laura tried to calm the children, assuring them that it was just the sound of the house, but as the days passed, the echoes began to become more persistent. At first, the voices only repeated what was being said, but soon they began to alter the words. "Laura, look for what you forgot. he whispered once, while Laura, alone in the library, turned slowly at the bewildering message. What had I forgotten? I couldn't remember. The echoes began to take on a more tangible form, as if the voices could see something she didn't. As she explored the house, she found old photos in the attic, faded images of people she didn't know. One of the portraits caught his attention, a man with a grim expression looking toward the camera with eyes full of despair. The house had secrets, and the echoes were just the beginning. One night, while the family was having dinner in the dining room, Sophia asked something that made the air freeze. "Mom, who is the man in the attic photo?" he asked innocently. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't mentioned anything about the photo. "What man?" he muttered, but before he could ask, the voice of the man in the photo spoke in the dining room. "Look at what you're hiding." Panic gripped Laura, but she still tried to rationalize what was happening. The voices were echoes, nothing more than that. But every time someone spoke, the echoes responded, and over time they began to reveal darker secrets. The man in the photo, the voice whispering in the night, began to put together pieces of a strange puzzle. That house had not only been his refuge, but also his prison. Laura began to investigate the history of the house, but the more she investigated, the more terrifying the revelation became. The house had originally been built by a man named Samuel, a hermit who had disappeared without a trace, but not before he had committed terrible acts. He had used the house as a refuge for those he had recruited from other nearby villages. No one knew for sure what was going on within the walls of the mansion, but the echoes, the whispers of those who had passed by, had never been extinguished. One night, while Laura was sleeping in her room, something strange happened. The echoes grew louder and louder, more intense until they began to transform into heart-rending screams. "Help, help me!" shouted a female voice, and Laura woke up breathing heavily. He got out of bed trembling and walked down the hall. In the mirror at the entrance, she saw her reflection, but she was not alone. Someone else was there, a shadow that vanished before he could scream. That same night, Alan and Sophia began to have nightmares. They woke up sobbing, terrified by the voices that spoke to them from the walls. "We are here with you," whispered the voices, as if they were trapped in the place. It wasn't just a game. It wasn't just an old house. They were trapped in something much bigger, something darker. Anxiety was building up in Laura. As the days went by, the echoes began to reveal more personal, deeper things. "Your mother is in danger," the voices whispered to Sophia, and then to Alan before they could tell Laura. Something was crumbling in the walls, and she could feel it. One day, Laura returned to the attic and found something that left her cold. A small old leather notebook, full of words written in dark ink. The words were written in a hurried manner, with palpable desperation. It was Samuel's story, but it was also his family's. He had invoked a dark covenant, one that bound him to the house forever, and to all those who moved there. He had used his own children. He had done horrible things to them, and the echoes were their trapped souls, doomed to repeat their cries eternally. Laura tried to destroy the notebook, burn it, but the echoes increased in intensity, and the voices began to scream louder. "You can't escape," said the voices, ringing in their ears, filled with hatred and despair. When she tried to flee with her children, Laura realized that the house would not let them leave. The doors slammed shut, the windows were tightly sealed, and echoes filled every corner. At that moment, the family understood the truth. The echoes were not only voices that responded to what they said. They were voices that revealed what had happened in the house, the sins committed by those who had lived there before. And now the family was caught in that same curse. Laura, in her desperation, tried to remember everything she had learned about the house, about the pact that had bound souls to those walls. But there was no way out. The voices increased in intensity, filling the house with a deafening roar. "They're here to stay," the final voice rang out, and with one last cry of terror, Laura and her family joined the echoes. The House of Echoes had claimed its last victim, and the voices continued to repeat their secrets, eternally trapped in the walls of that forgotten mansion. The small village of San Esteban, nestled in the mountains and surrounded by the thick forest, seemed a quiet place. The stone houses, the red-tiled roofs, and the cobbled streets gave a feeling of serenity, almost from another time. However, beneath that apparent calm, something dark and fearsome had stalked its inhabitants since time immemorial. Every evening, when the sun began to hide behind the trees and the cool night air began to fill the streets, a bell rang in the village church. It was not a normal bell. Its sound did not announce the time, nor did it call for prayer. Every time the bell rang in the air, someone in the village died. No one knew how or why, but everyone knew that the sound was an omen. A death was about to come. The bell was the soul of the people, the dark conscience that kept the balance of fear. The villagers knew this, and though superstition had plagued them for generations, none could escape the unease of hearing its chime. The bell, with its deep, dull sound, was a sentence, and everyone lived under its shadow. Among the inhabitants of San Esteban, no one dared to ask too much. No one wanted to investigate the origins of the bell, for it had always been said that anyone who tried would meet an even more gruesome death. However, that apparent tranquility, the resigned acceptance of fate, was going to be upset one autumn afternoon. That afternoon, the town was full of rumors. The bell had rung louder than usual. No one remembered hearing such a brutal ringing or so often. For some, the sound was so heartbreaking that houses shook. One woman, Araceli, felt the air thicken, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with something more than fear. His hands twitched as he heard the deep vibration of the metal. His mother, who had always been very superstitious, had told him stories about the bell. He had always said that sound was a reflection of what would happen, and that the louder it was heard, the more imminent death was. That same night, when the shadows were already lengthening in the streets and the trees were rustling in the wind, Araceli walked home, quickening her pace. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks, but as he approached the edge of the village, he saw a stooped figure, standing, looking toward the church. He was a man of the people, Javier, known for his solitary character. His face was distorted, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to look away. "Javier," Araceli called him. "Are you okay?" The man did not react. He didn't seem to hear her. Then a shudder ran through Araceli's body when she heard again the bell ringing. It was a long, deep sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was the harbinger of death. Javier's figure began to move slowly as if he were shedding an invisible weight, and with each step he took, his eyes seemed to lose their focus. Darkness enveloped him. Araceli, horrified, approached cautiously. It was then that he saw Javier's hand tremble in the air, as if he were looking for something that did not exist. Javier's scream was the last thing Araceli heard before the bell rang again. Once again the bell rose, and with its echo, death took its form. Javier fell to the ground like a broken wrist as his body began to be claimed by the darkness. Someone had died, and the people, as always, did not know how or why. From that night on, things began to change. People began to see shadows they couldn't explain, murmurs that crossed the streets in silence. No one could be sure they were safe. The inhabitants of San Esteban knew that when the bell rang, death was near, but they never expected that this closeness would become more palpable than ever. Every time the bell rang, someone disappeared. Children no longer played in the streets in the evening. Adults were rushing to close their doors and windows. No one wanted to be next. No one could predict who would be the next to fall. The bell resounded so loudly that it felt as if its echo pierced the bones. There was no peace. There was no hope. People started talking. Some said that the bell had been cursed since its creation. Others believed that someone from deep within the church had invoked a dark force to punish the people. The most superstitious said that the bell would only be silent when all the inhabitants of San Esteban were dead, one by one. And as if it were a sign, a new wave of panic quickly spread through the village. Some tried to flee, but those who did never returned. The roads around St. Stephen's seemed to close behind them, as if an invisible veil separated them from the outside world. People who ventured too far did not return, and those who did were empty-eyed, as if they had seen something that could not be explained. Finally, a group of brave people decided to face the unknown. They went inside the church to investigate the origin of the bell. Araceli, distraught but determined, joined the group, wanting to understand what was happening. They couldn't sit idly by while death took away more and more people. What they found inside the church was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The bell, suspended in the air, seemed to radiate a dark energy, as if it were alive. No one dared to approach. The bell, its metal blackened by the passage of time, vibrated gently. The walls of the church creaked as if something was about to break. The clocks of the church, without any explanation, marked the exact same time, the hour of death. At that moment, Araceli felt a presence behind her. He turned quickly, but all he could see was an imposing shadow, a masked figure emerging from the darkness. The bell, now fully resonant, emitted a thunderous sound that made the ground beneath his feet tremble. One by one, the brave ones fell, as if the air itself had become poisonous. Araceli was the last to be left standing. As the echo of the bell echoed in his chest, he realized that death was not something that could be avoided, that the bell was not a mere instrument of warning, but the very face of death. The figure that had stalked her, the shadow that had watched her for so long, slowly approached. "It's too late for everyone, child," whispered the shadow. Before Araceli could react, the bell rang for the last time. A shudder ran through her body, and an unsettling peace enveloped her. The last bell rang in the air, and with it, the fate of San Esteban was sealed. Death had claimed everyone. The campaign stopped, and everything was silent. The village had been consumed, and there was no trace of its inhabitants. The church was in ruins, the bell no longer sounded. But in the fog that surrounded the town, its echoes seemed to continue to resound. The town of San Esteban disappeared, but its history was never forgotten. The echo of the bell was still alive, waiting for the next victim, the next soul that crossed its path. Thus ended the last bell. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing, as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna, no, this can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something. "Anna, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. In the house, replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else. Something he couldn't understand. Something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else. And then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again. Too much silence. As if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, and at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. Each night, the city fell into a deep, dark silence, as if time itself stood still. The moonlight barely made it through the heavy clouds that crept across the sky. It was an oppressive stillness, interrupted only by the sudden roar of the storm that began promptly at midnight. No one in the city knew where it came from, but everyone knew its destructive power. Every time he started, the city trembled as if it was under the control of a force beyond his comprehension. The storm brought with it not only the torrential rain and the fierce wind, but something much more terrifying. When thunder echoed in the sky, so did whispers. Whispers that seemed to come from the shadows, floating through the trees, sneaking through the windows, whispering things that only you knew. Secrets, fears, forgotten desires. Everything you had tried to hide over the years was revealed in those dark moments, as if the storm was drawn from your worst nightmares. The first to notice the storm were the most vulnerable, children. They woke up in the middle of the night, sweaty and scared, with the echo of strange voices floating in their heads. Many said that the storm spoke to them, that they saw dark figures moving through the rain. The shadows that emerged from the drop seemed more human than spectral. Some even swore that the figures stared at them from the other side of the windows, their eyes as empty as the abyss itself. As the storm raged, its effects spread beyond the minds of children. No one was safe. Adults were beginning to lose their sanity. The city, which once seemed to be at peace, was transformed into a place full of murmurs and disturbing whispers. The empty streets were not enough to avoid the feeling of being followed, of being observed. No one could sleep, but no one dared to talk about what was happening. The terror was so deep that even the words felt dangerous, as if talking about the storm brought with it an even worse curse. Of all the people affected, the one who was most affected by the storm was Clara, a young woman who had lived in the city all her life. Clara was strong, skeptical, and had always thought that fear was just a construct of the human mind. But one night, as the clock struck 12 and the storm began to break out, Clara felt for the first time a chill run down her spine. She was alone in her house. The sound of rain beating against the windows was all she could hear, but then the whisper came. First, a faint, barely audible murmur, as if someone were in the same room as her. Clara looked around, but the house was empty. There was nothing and no one. However, the whisper persisted. It slipped into his ears, whispering something he couldn't understand. Each time I tried to block out the sound, it got louder. "Clara," murmured the voice, this time clearer. His own name, whispered by someone he couldn't see. Panic began to grow inside her. Her breathing became erratic and her heart was pounding. He looked out the window, looking for any signs that might make sense of what he felt. But there was nothing, only darkness and rain. Still, I knew something else was going on. Something dark. Something that had been haunting the city for years, and now it had reached it. The storm brought not only rain and wind, but something far worse. An ancient force that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to manifest. Over the next few weeks, the storm continued to batter the city each night, bringing with it more mysterious figures. Some of them seemed to be people Clara knew, but their behavior was strange and erratic. Sometimes the figures appeared in the streets, other times in her dreams, always empty-eyed and smiles twisted, staring at her, waiting for her to recognize them. The shadows lengthened and the voices multiplied. Clara no longer knew if she was awake or dreaming, if the storm was really there or if her mind was falling apart. Panic soon took over the city. People began fleeing their homes, seeking shelter in places far from the storm. But wherever they went, the storm followed them. No one was safe. The streets were filled with shadows, with figures that seemed to belong to another world. But the worst thing was that those figures were not strangers. The voices whispering in the darkness were of acquaintances, of loved ones, of those who had once stood by them and who were now nothing more than echoes of a past life. Desperation took hold of the city's inhabitants, but there was no escape. There was no end to the storm, and its effects were becoming more and more terrifying. Houses began to collapse, lights suddenly went out, and dark figures became more aggressive. Some tried to resist, clinging to the hope that it would all end at dawn. But that hope was quickly extinguished. Clara, now on the verge of madness, decided to face the storm once and for all. She knew that something in her was calling her, that the storm was not a simple weather manifestation. It was something much deeper, something that had been waiting for someone to confront it. The only way to end all that, Clara thought, was to face the darkness itself. So on a moonless night, he plucked up the courage and took to the streets of the city. The rain was pounding furiously and the wind seemed to rip everything in its path. But Clara did not hesitate. She advanced through the deserted streets, guided only by the echo of her own fear. That's when she saw it. In the center of the city, where the shadows seemed denser, a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall figure wrapped in a black cloak that floated around him as if the air itself feared him. Clara didn't know if she was seeing a person or an entity, but something inside her knew that figure was the key. The figure slowly approached, and as it did, the voices grew louder. "Clara, come," whispered the shadows, getting closer and closer. "Come and know your destiny." The figure stopped in front of Clara, and at that moment his face appeared. It wasn't human, but it wasn't something Clara could understand either. It was a face formed by darkness itself, a mask that was constantly changing, absorbing everything it touched. "We've been waiting for you," the figure said in a tone that echoed in his mind. "The storm is just the beginning. Your soul is scarred, Clara. And now, at last, you will be a part of this eternal place. Come to us." Clara, with terror taking over her body, took a step back. Shadows surrounded her, and mysterious figures began to emerge from all sides. Murmurs filled the air, and the figure in front of her stretched out a hand towards her. I knew I couldn't escape. Panic paralyzed her, and in that instant she realized that the storm was not a natural force, but something far more sinister. She had been summoned by something dark, and no matter how strong her will was, it was too late. The city, the storm, the shadows, all came together in one point, and Clara faded into the darkness, becoming one of the figures who roamed the streets every night, trapped in an eternal cycle of terror. The midnight storm never stopped.